So where do you live?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope that everyone had a nice lunch and enjoyed some of our hospitality. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce a man who's pretty special around here. He is our beloved dean, Dave Meyer. Dave Meyer is an internationally known expert in family law. He has consulted in a lot of the same-sex marriage cases, which I consider a form of reparations. And so he is going to welcome you guys with some afternoon welcome remarks. And so without any further ado, our dean, Dave Meyer.
Thank you, Sue. That is hands down the best introduction I have ever gotten in my life, because I have never before been referred to as beloved in an introduction. And how can you beat that? That's just awesome. So thank you. Well, I just wanted to take the opportunity to welcome you all officially, a little late, but we're so thrilled to have you here. This is such a, for somebody affiliated with Tulane, it brings a lot of pride to see all of you gathered here in this place. I just wanted to say a word of appreciation first of all, to all of you who are participating in the conference for traveling in, and those of you coming from the Northeast. I've chatted with several of you who dodged, found a little window between the Nor'easters to get down here, and of course some of you coming from much farther distances. So thank you for being here. And a word of appreciation also about the importance of the conversation that you are having here today. Obviously, the work that you're doing and to have so many legendary figures on these topics gathered in one place is a special opportunity. Sadly, we have to acknowledge that the relevance of the conversation about racial reconciliation and redress of oppression is not a matter of historical redress only. Obviously, it's very much in the here and now, and sometimes seems increasingly in the here and now. And so I just wanted to express that appreciation for what you're doing in this conversation. Also express my appreciation to Professor Westley, and congratulations for his hard work in bringing all of this together and recruiting all of you to come to Tulane. It's a lot of work goes into this, I know, and our incredible staff members who support it as well. And then finally, a special word of appreciation to Gordon and Grace Gamm, who Gordon is here and has just arrived, and as he is, Robert Westley is very proud this year to hold the title of the Gordon Gamm Faculty Scholar, and through that recognition of Robert's expertise and accomplishment makes possible this conference, both through the generous financial support of Gordon and Grace Gamm, but also really equally important and very distinctive, also the intellectual and moral support of Gordon and Grace Gamm, who come to this each year to the Gamm conference at Tulane, and support it with their ideas and their intellectual energy. And so we're extremely lucky to have them as members of our community. They come from Boulder, Colorado, and Gordon is an extremely successful trial lawyer and a great humanist and a great visionary, and just a wonderful human being. So Gordon, thank you, and I know Grace will join us later. So thank you. So with that, I will turn the podium back to its rightful owner, and thank you.
I just wanted to make an announcement that there have been a few changes in the schedule to accommodate the travel of some of our speakers. So we're going to begin now with the panel on U.S.-based perspectives on slavery reparations, but then afterwards it will be followed by the Complicity, Accountability, and Transitional Justice panel that was originally scheduled for Saturday at 2:45. That panel has now been moved to 3:30 today. And the 3:30 panel today, that was the National Responses to State-Sponsored Atrocity and Dispossession, the Indigeneity panel, is now going to be at Saturday at 1 o'clock. And we're going to close out on tomorrow with the German model panel. So I know that's a lot of changes, but it allows us to preserve the final panel, which I think is extremely important. One other note about that final panel is that, unfortunately, Professor Darren Johnson is not going to be able to join us. He had a family emergency, and he's not going to be here. And although Ann Farrow is not going to be here because of health reasons, I believe she did send along her paper, and Saru has agreed to do her best imitation of Ann Farrow.
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So,
Improv class, say yes.
so I hope that wasn't too confusing. I just wanted to introduce the members of our next panel who are here. This is the U.S.-based Perspectives on Slavery Reparations, and we have Adjoa Ayatoro, who is first and foremost an activist attorney. She's been an activist her entire life, and she's now a professor emeritus at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, and she's one of the founding members of the National Coalition for Blacks in America.
Reparations in America.
I'm sorry, for Reparations in America, excuse me. We also have Tunine Chisholm here, and she is a current member of the Campbell Law School faculty. We have, in addition, Harold McDougall. Harold is here, and Harold is on the faculty at Howard University Law School. And we have John Torpy on this panel. And John is a professor of sociology and history and the director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center at CUNY. So let's start with our next panel. So you guys, you decide.
Did you want me to go first? Who's first on the list?
You?
I'm last, so I'll just go without the...
Okay, thanks. Hello, everybody. I have a bit of a cold, so, please bear with me. The subject of my paper that was published a while ago really was it's called The Case for Black Reparations. It was a review of a book that had been written by Boris Bitger, Yale Law School. As it turned out, he actually asked me to work on it with him, but I refused because I was doing something else. But it was actually modeled after a student note that I'd published in the Yale Law Journal called The Case for Black Juries, which was a defense for Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale was saying that he couldn't get a fair trial because they were all-white jury, and so I looked at what are juries, how do they function? Fast forward, many years later, I found myself writing a review of his book. And Boris basically took the position that, we have this problem with reparations, that people who were enslaved are all dead. So what are we going to do about that? So he said, well, how about we have reparations for segregation, because there's still some plaintiffs, alive. And when I reviewed the book, I said, well, how about, that's de jure segregation. That is a while ago. How about de facto segregation? I started looking at de facto segregation. I started looking at what's called resegregation, where even though you have black and white kids, let's say in integrated schools, the black kids are all shoveled off into special education programs or emotionally disturbed categories. They're suspended like 3 and 4 times more frequently than white kids, expelled, things like that. But, in the kind of the global context of the things that I've been hearing, especially my Howard colleague who spoke the keynote, it's obviously much larger. What I documented is just one of many instances of terrible things that have been done to people of African descent worldwide. And so I found myself looking again at the question through the lens that I asked my students to look at, which is, what's the problem? Where did it come from? What's been tried already? We had a conversation about this, about the historical stuff that she was presenting, because the history tells us not just what happened, but how it happened. And when we look at how it happened, we can learn about how it's happening now, because I think that our discussion has to be very much about not just these concepts in the abstract, but how are we going to put these things into practice? What's the problem? Where did it come from? What's been tried already? Why didn't that work? What can we try that's new? One of the things that didn't work, obviously, I heard again my colleague, I'm not going to try to pronounce your name with this cold. Can you pronounce your name there for me? Yes? Araujo. Okay, I think I got as close as I can get. Anyway, it's good? Anna, okay, Anna. Anna was talking about this kind of interplay between impulses towards exclusion and regularization that comes out of the all over the African diaspora. Think about civil rights, for example. We want to be treated like everybody else. Maybe the government is the agency that we seek redress from. But there's another strain. There's always another strain, which is that we want our own. In the African American community, for example, you had Du Bois on one side, W.B. Du Bois on one side, Booker T on the other. Very interesting that Garvey was one of Booker T's followers, not Du Bois. So we have these kinds of this interplay between we want to be treated like everybody else. We want our humanity to be recognized. We want government to protect us. On the other hand, we want our own. We don't really care what other people think of us. We want our own. And reparations, in some sense, kind of falls into that second category. Well, it's very interesting because the original Brown versus Board of Education litigation that was developed over several generations. I mean, Charles Hamilton Houston built that litigation over like 25 or 30 years. And each time it got closer and closer to the goal. Their goal from the very beginning was, it was a 14th Amendment violation, 1983, violation. They were actually looking for damages. Their original idea was that Plessy versus Ferguson has not been honored because separate, okay, we get that. But we weren't equal. So their idea was, we're going to try to make southern states and southern governments make the segregated facilities equal. And they won't be able to pay for that, so they'll cave on the other piece. That was what they were thinking. Then a young woman, law student at Howard, her name was Pauli Murray, had written a paper saying that the notion of getting them to make the facilities equal, pay that money, it's never going to work. We would be better off just saying that we should get rid of segregation completely. So if you look at it, from a law perspective, you look at two different kinds of remedies. One's called an injunction. The other one is damages. So essentially, what Houston and his people at Pauli Murray's behest did was they shifted from an action for damages to one for an injunction. Like, let segregation stop now. We won't ask you how much damage it did to us all this time. So essentially, the civil rights movement kind of turned a corner there and turned a corner away from the reparations that Adjoa and her folks have been talking about. So, we now have this kind of class issue in the African American community, at least, where, there are people who are middle class, by one way or another, they've developed a certain level of facility in the existing system and have achieved a certain level of success in the existing system. And they want more protection, they want more rights, but they don't really want their own. And we have this problem with Brown versus Board of Education. We have a whole generation of kids, now adults, who do not feel validated unless they're surrounded by white people. I mean, this is what Brown versus Board of Education was saying. You know, if you keep black people all by themselves, they're going to feel inferior. Why do you feel inferior? Because you're black. I mean, you know, black people have just paid, and some fellow travelers have just paid almost $1 billion to see a movie that's about nothing but black people. So I think that was a mistake. So we have to kind of fix this. I mean, I think that the point is that Du Bois and Booker T are not separate conflicting figures. They're two sides of the same coin. You cannot be respected if you have nothing. And if you have nothing, nobody's going to respect you. So I think that the reparations struggle really has to kind of find a way to have a dialogue with the rest of the community that is talking about, well, we want to be, you know, we want to be included, we want to be treated, you know, fairly. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to try to be really quick and get to what I've been writing about recently, which is how do you do this? I have a piece that's coming out of the National Lawyers Guild Review right now that explores the conflict between the hierarchical impulses of human civilization and the desire of us to treat each other properly. You know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's at the core of the whole human rights discourse. There's a poster about it in the United Nations. But we are wedded to hierarchy and subordination in a way that's very, very insidious. It is, however, not how we were genetically programmed. Homo sapiens have been on the planet for 200,000 years. We're the most recent of the human chain. We have lived like this for less than 15,000 years. So everything that we do, the way we stand, the way we carry things, the way we eat, the way we treat each other, right now, it's all 15,000 years old. We, however, are 200,000 years old. Our genetic programming pushes us to relate most closely to people in a group of about 20. And in order to relate to people on a much larger scale, we have to create something that one author calls an imagined reality. Those imagined realities turn out to be always hierarchical. And if you look at almost every movement for social justice, it has started with a vanguard group of about 20 people who have an intimate connection with one another, who trust one another, who are ready to give their lives for one another. But then they have to convince other people to come along, and they've never been able to figure out how to do that without creating another imagined reality. And that imagined reality is inexorably, it is hierarchical. What I've been writing about is that the only way to do this is by using cells. You have to have cells, and the cells cannot be directed from the top. They have to be organized, and so that what people want to do with their power, with their energy, goes through the cells up to the, you know, kind of not really up to the top, but it's a center periphery model. The piece will be out in about a month. You'll be able to read it. But I think that we have to change the way that we do social justice, the way that we do social change in a radical way. I mean, I think everything that everybody's doing here, all the historians, all the lawyers, all the great ideas, it's wonderful stuff. Just like the movie, Wakanda, you know, it's wonderful stuff. People are fired up by it, but they're not really going to go to the mat because of a movie. They're not going to go to the mat because of something that they read in a law review article. They're only going to do that if they feel connected to each other, and that's a connection that we don't have. Everyone who is involved in a social justice movement has to face the fact that we have to be able to build connection with other people. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. That's it. Thanks.
Well, I agree with you on Brown v. Board of Education.
Okay.
I first want to start, thank you. I want to start by connecting myself. I'm a descendant of an enslaved African woman, Belle Jones, who was raped by a white naval officer and then sold down the river from St. Louis to New Orleans. I am here to talk about a current movement. It's not really a movement, part of the reparations movement that is being waged now in support of the Georgetown University 272. Descendants of enslaved Africans who were sold in 1838 primarily to white, of course, political and financial leaders in New Orleans. They were sold to benefit Georgetown University. They were sold by the Jesuits, who had a plantation in Maryland and who actually created and ran Georgetown University. And in fact, the leader of the effort to get approval for the university and for the Jesuits really to sell these enslaved Africans was in fact the president at that time of Georgetown University, Father Mulledy, and another Jesuit as well. We came on and we were asked, a group of us, in fact, the first person that was asked was Carlton Waterhouse, who is a professor in Indiana University School of Law. It's not the right name, but you get it. But, and he contacted several of us asking if we would join the legal team. I was asked, my brother here, was asked, Robert Wesley, and there are several others that were asked. The effort we thought was going to be one, and still has been, one of simply guiding the descendant group that we represent, but also interfacing with Georgetown and the Jesuits to kind of, I would term it, I'm a long-time litigator, did class action litigation, so I view it as, pre-litigation negotiation. Of course, we're looking at how to sue. It's much more difficult than, it might be not close to impossible, because I don't believe anything's impossible, but to avoid sanctions, we don't want to just sue and then somehow we get hit with sanctions like many civil rights groups have gotten in the past. But we were really working, I think, in good faith, I know in good faith, thinking we could convince Georgetown and the Jesuits to come to the table with the descendants. And our push had always been for not just our group of descendants, but for all descendants. So when Carlton and I met with the Chief of Staff, Joe Ferrara, of the President of Georgetown University in October 2016, we said very clearly, even though we represent a number of descendants, we are actually speaking that you need to bring all descendants to the table to negotiate a form of what we've begun calling a reparatory justice package. So far, of course, that hasn't come to pass, but I want to talk about it in the context of how white supremacy has actually led the way, not just in slavery. I think it's easy for us to kind of look at, well, yeah, slavery was about white supremacy and, white folks getting the benefit of black labor and, for nothing to build their kingdoms, and then, of course, or even their little middle-class homes, if there were middle class back there, but really at the sacrifice of the bodies of the enslaved. And so that's easy to picture. We can see that, right? But I want to talk about how it continues to this day in much more polite context, in much more polite discussion. And in fact, when I have, and some of you, most of you don't know me, but Robert knows me and Nasu knows me a tiny bit, I just call it as I see it, even in meetings with the powerful white folk, right? And so even when you confront them and say you are just continuing, which I've done on several occasions in meetings, this yes sir massa, no sir massa kind of interaction with our clients, with the descendants, they're like, oh my God, that was harsh. What's true? Is it true? It could be harsh, but is it true? And they somehow can never answer that is it true question. So we have been working with them on behalf of our clients, and as I said, really we've been trying to work when we speak about all the descendants, not just come to the table with our clients, since October 2016. And it's been kind of a very interesting journey, to put it mildly. But what we did was we engaged them in October. They, and this is the game all of us have probably heard, whether it's, in whatever forum we kind of work. It's like, very much in agreement. Oh, yes, that's very interesting. Oh, we want to look at that. We want to work on that. And then nothing, right? So all of us in some way are used to that. It gets even more insidious when they decided that their way of resolving this was to, well, back in 2015, the Georgetown president formed a working group because they somehow just discovered this history, right? So they formed this working group. The working group were made up of professors and alums and noted business people in the community and one or two students. Not one descendant was included in that working group. Their first response to that was, we thought all the enslaved Africans that we sold died. That's what we were told, they died. Okay. But one of their alumni, Richard Cellini, began researching and finding descendants after descendants after descendants, right? He now counts that minimally 6,000 descendants, and it's growing, right? So then, and they never then step back and say, well, we need to add at least one or two descendants to our working group. They never did that. When asked about this in October and later of 2016, their response was, oh, well, we just thought we'd work on it first and then go to the descendants. Well, their going to the descendants has never been to include them in a important and meaningful dialogue with them on how do we address this. What they've done is they play this same game, kind of like, part of like the Willie Lynch game of divide, you know, so that, and we confronted them in October 2016, and we continue to confront them, because instead of bringing the descendants together, they are reinforcing this view like, well, I got something going on because the master answers my call, right? So they got the descendant groups feeling their big shots, because when they call Joe Ferrara, he answers, right? And of course, again, we've confronted them with this, that this is a way of them keeping that division going among the descendants. So they feel like somehow that they've created in some ways a competitive relationship that, you know, they didn't just create that. We understand what happened in slavery and all of that. So, but they built on that. So then they decided that they were going to have a liturgy in April of 2017. And that was their time to apologize, and they were going to rename these buildings that they had changed the names to Freedom Hall and something else, right? I don't want to keep looking at my notes, so that's why I keep saying and something else, right? So what they did was they first, and this is a working group, right, made up of black people, white people, they decided they were going to name one of them Isaac Hall. Well, our clients and other descendants were totally upset when this was publicized, because he actually carried, you know, whether or not we should be proud of it or not, he carried the last name of one of the slave owners, which was Hawkins. So that's another layer of disrespect. Why should it be Isaac Hall? It took the Board of Trustees several months and a lot of pressure. Finally, at the end in March, they reversed it and said it will be called Isaac Hawkins Hall. Just this one symbol of disrespect and then respect, even though some of us, you know, would say Isaac Hawkins Hall really is a slave name, so to speak, but at least it shows a level of respect with the last name. So the liturgy, we said, okay, this is an opportunity. They showed us the schedule. Our legal team said this is an opportunity of having a time slot where you will hold kind of a session where all the descendants get together with the leadership of Georgetown and the Jesuits to, you know, ask questions, say their viewpoints, you know, to kind of have this dialogue. Again, that kind of like, you know, when I was looking at the two-faced, somebody had the two-faced, who was that? Who did the two-faced, the Jonas? You did? I thought about what the Native Americans said, white men speak with forked tongue. You know, it's the same thing. It's hypocrisy. It's saying A, but really knowing you don't mean A, you actually mean F, right? So this is what they were doing. So fine. They're saying, oh, that's a good idea, you know, and I'm working with them, Carlton's working with them to get this done. And all of a sudden, about 10 days before the liturgy, they said, oh, we just don't have time to put it in the program. But, again, remember I told you this toying, this, dealing with this competitiveness, but we can meet with your clients the day after the liturgy. So, of course, we have a responsibility. Those of you who are lawyers and maybe non-lawyers know we can't just say hell no, because they were making an offer to our clients. We had a responsibility of taking it to our clients. We took it to our clients, and I could have kissed every last one of them on that call, because they said, hell no. You tell them that what we want is then if they aren't going to do it, we want them to schedule breakfast, we want them to feed us, and we'll invite all the descendants. Well, I did the email back, a very, very crisp but nice email, nice from my perspective, email, and Carlton, I'm driving, I'm going to a meeting, and Carlton's calling me on the phone, and I usually don't answer my cell phones, but I somehow heard the urgency in the ring, right? He says, they've just emailed us, they want to talk right now. I said, I'm doing my errands. I can't talk right now. You tell them we'll call them this afternoon. Oh, well, and they backed up. So what we did was we said, fine. Then what we need to do, and we developed a thing where they were going to have a meeting with the representatives of each descendant group, and it was going to be at Georgetown, in which they discussed how to go forward, right? Did that. So the question was, everybody was on the phone except, of course, the Georgetown people, and I live in D.C., and Joe said, but you can be on the call. Well, I remember a long time ago, in all the years I had in terms of litigation and negotiation, if you can be at the table, you be at the table. You're not on the phone, you're at the table. So I went on, got to the meeting. We had a proposal which Joe Ferrara accepted, and he presented it. We co-chaired this meeting, and the proposal was, which I was thinking we'd get kickback from the descendants, was Georgetown and the Jesuits develop a proposal for bringing us together to talk about a reparatory justice package and do it by May 1. Long story short, I'm thinking, oh my God, we got these, they're going to scream, oh, why wasn't I part of this? To a letter, there was no objection from any of the descendants. In fact, the only ones that spoke were the ones that were laying out Georgetown for taking so long to do da-da-da-da-da. They agreed with one modification. One of the Jesuits said, May 1st is a bad time, and I reflected because I come from academia. I wasn't in academia at that point, but I come. May 1st is bad, we got finals. We said, okay, they changed it to June 1. June 1, if I got it, you got it. Nothing happened. Call me, panic, Joe Ferrer, we need some help. So me and Nkechi Taifa, another member of our team, went and met with them from June through August. The last meeting was September 1st, to attempt to assist them in developing this proposal. In September, they said, we'll take it from here. We'll do it. We'll develop it. I won't tell you, I have time to tell you all that happened between June and September. We said, fine. We didn't hear anything until January, in December 9th, the Jesuit, Tim Kasiki, the head of the Jesuits for Canada and the United States, and the Maryland province, the head of the Maryland province, announced they were going down on December 9th to meet with some of the descendants, because Tim Kasiki said, well, no, none of the descendants have told me they want to come to the table. Well, what we did, he's right, I'm an activist. We had several meetings with our clients who were, going or either going to be already in Louisiana, and I told them, every time you're called on to speak, the first thing you say is, we want you to come to the table, every time. And so what happened is, our clients did that, and other people did that. We want you to come to the table. So when they come back after their visit, they say, well, we did hear, and people say they really want us to get together and meet with everyone. So we get a email thank you, Jacob, for letting me print this. Helping me print this, from them on January 12th. This was January 12th. They sent us, and not just us, the whole client group, an email. Joe Farrar sent it on behalf of the Jesuits. I may not have time to read it all, but basically, it's in our conversations with many of you, and then went on to say, in deep prayer and meditation, we've decided that, we should come together. With a sense of humility and gratitude. I'm just leaving some highlights of this. The plan was, in coming weeks, we would like to work with you and other members of the descendant community to arrange a series of in-person meetings. And you already had in-person meetings. I want to show you our answer. And so now we have a system of proposed guideline principles for dialogue and partnership and collaboration. Structure and how we're going to relate to them, right? This is the master controlling the dialogue. I like somebody said, a felon cannot determine, I can't remember the exact words, the punishment, right? But they want to be in control of it. So then they send us some principles. These are the draft principles. Real quick, I won't read them all, but we value the points of view of each other, each member of the groups. We will focus on finding common ground. We will be ambitious in developing our shared goals, okay? Well, needless to say, after I read this and some of our clients read this and some of our legal team read it, we weren't pleased. I'll put it nicely. We weren't pleased. But we wrote a response, and I'll read it as quickly as I can. We say, thank you for sending us to January 12th. Very polite. I learned that when I was in the South. You always start out being polite, and then you go on and with your punch, right? So here, we say, although we appreciate receiving these ideas from you, we are concerned with the delay in receiving the proposal, the delay that is further built into the proposal, the lack of full acknowledgement of the role the Jesuits in Georgetown played in the stripping of the human rights of the men, women, and children, in quotes, owned by the Jesuits and sold as if they were chattel to save Georgetown University, and the document's vagueness and lack of concreteness. So we went on. I'm not going to read it all because she's going to tell me soon. My time is up. So we sent that to them. That was February 2nd. We sent a reply to their January 12th. We heard nothing other than the polite, got it, received it, we'll get back to you on it. So we have several strategies that we are looking at. One was, of course, this trying to push negotiation and all of that. We now have, and I'm going to ask you, those of you who will and can, if you can help us with one of the strategies. We have a sign-on letter, and I have it here. You can see who signed on. We have some notables, if you're into notables, and we have some maybe non-notables if you're more egalitarian, right? And we have people, so if you want to hear the notables, we have the NAACP, we have Jesse Jackson. I mean, we've got, I view notable as the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the National Bar Association, so the National Association for Black Psychologists, Black Psychiatrists. So I am asking you all, if anyone is willing and interested and can, we would like you to sign on to this letter. It's an open letter to the Jesuits in Georgetown. Very nice, very polite. I'm not asking you all to do anything not becoming the people that you are, but really it's saying, come sit at the table. It's time for you to sit at the table. So I would like you, and I've got several for you if you want to read it. Of course you want to read it before you sign it, just to make sure we're not doing something, not nice. And then if you can print, I have something you could print your name, and if you have a title you'd like us to use. Titles are really good if you can use your title, because it shows them that these are not just, we can just go on the corner and ask people to sign, because we're going to do that next. We've got a color of change is taking it up, and so we're going to do that next. But we do want them to see a level of commitment. The other thing I mentioned earlier is we're looking at litigation. We have Howard University law students in the clinic, led by one of our attorneys, Justin Hansford, and they are working on researching filing a claim against them first in the DC Human Rights Commission. Those are our strategies, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions when we come time to questions, but I really hope some of you will sign on to the letter. Thank you.
Okay. Excuse Excuse me, thank you for being here. It's not on. Is that working now? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I first want to thank Robert Wesley for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here, and I think it's already been mentioned, but I started to work on a project about the idea of reparations for historical injustices better part of 20 years ago at this point, and one of the first things I read was his article about why we need to switch from a kind of affirmative action logic or language to that of reparations, and it was a big influence on me, so I appreciate that. And I did want to say that I would be much better dressed if I had realized that I was talking today. I got a full outfit that I was going to wear tomorrow, but I'm sorry, you just get the sweater version today. But some of what I want to say kind of follows on some of the discussion, really, following Anna's outstanding and informative lecture. And it has to do, you know, with the language of reparations. So when I wrote this book, well, I guess it came out 13 years ago or something, I kind of came to the conclusion that the term reparations was problematic in American political discourse. And so in a way, ever since then, ever since working on that book, I've been trying to think about, you know, how do we repair 400 years of white racial domination in the United States and the various problems and inequalities that have flowed from that. But I got into the topic really in some ways initially because I was starting to fly to Canada, as I was telling Caleb at lunch, and started seeing this term reparations being used. And as somebody who had a certain background in German history, 20th century German history, it struck me that this term was being used in a totally different way than had been used in the case of, you know, reparations coming out of the Versailles Treaty and that sort of thing, which was basically a fine leveled by the winners of the war. The winners of the war said the losers started it and caused it, and it was all their fault, and they were going to pay for it. And obviously, the term was being used at that time in the Canadian context. I don't know where Caleb is, in a very different sort of way. So the language, the term, it seems to me, is extremely kind of flexible, means a lot of different things. Badrinath has pointed out to us in his talk that there are these guidelines that the UN has adopted with this endless title because it was a lawyer's thing, excuse me. You know, the basic guidelines for reparation for, you know, gross violations of human rights and blah, blah, blah. And it goes on for as long as, you know, one of my papers. But in any case, it suggests that there are all these different meanings of the term. And part of what was sort of difficult to figure out when I was working on this book was, you know, how much in different cases did the material compensation matter, and how much did other things matter, symbolisms and memorials and having your name expunged from the rolls of those who'd been arrested and all these kinds of things. So to me, the point is really about the goal, and the terms that are used are in a certain sense not so important. And indeed, I think in the American case, the term reparations, as I say, kind of gets in the way of the goal. And I think there's a reason, I mean, there is a reason that in the Japanese-American case, they used the term redress, not reparations. And, well, they used the term Japanese-American redress because, I mean, it seems to be a sort of historical idiosyncrasy, but for some reason, the people who were involved in that effort were consulting with John Dean. Remember Richard Nixon's lawyer? And he advised them that, you know, there was no constitutional right to reparations or reparation, but there was a constitutional right to redress, and that they should therefore, you know, sort of mold their efforts around this notion of redress, not reparations. And, you know, they were also sort of concerned about, you know, he was saying, or actually it was Senator Daniel Inouye was advising them as well, and he said, you know, you're sort of talking about the the wrong that was done to Japanese Americans. He said, forget that. Nobody cares about that. He said, what you want to really talk about is the wrong that was done to the U.S. Constitution. Americans do care about that. And, in their effort sort of worked out, and whether it's because of those things or not is not clear, but so I guess what I'm saying is a lot of this to me is a kind of a framing issue, and it seems to me that one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we're focused on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and to me the outcome is racial equality, whatever exactly that means. But it seems to me that, in the face of these sort of historically unpromising prospects for rectifying the wrongs that are rooted in our white supremacist past, that I think the thing to do is to see to it that a bipartisan congressional investigation is created, impaneled, that looks into the nature and causes of and remedies for racial inequalities. That investigation would have to involve the leading historians of slavery, segregation, and race in the country, as well as sociologists, economists, and political scientists who've studied the social, economic, and political dimensions of racial inequality in the United States. The ultimate aim would be to create a blue ribbon panel of investigators tasked with the production of a definitive report on the history of racial inequality in the United States and a series of recommendations aiming to ameliorate that inequality. The disparities that I described earlier in this paper, different life expectancies, different wealth outcomes, ownership of wealth, different rates of incarceration, all the kinds of things that, bring us here really today. We have to explore the fact that those things did not begin last year. Historians notwithstanding, these things didn't start last year, and therefore, we have to look into their roots, which go back a good distance. And, they may not lie exactly in slavery, but to some degree, it all starts there. But as you've pointed out, with no living, survivors of slavery, it's very hard, certainly, to make a legal case on the basis of slavery itself. So we need to explore these phenomena from the ground up. Only thus can we expect to begin adequately to rectify them, and in so doing, to form a more perfect union, as the American Constitution enjoins us to do. So the body I'm suggesting would have to explore the following. First, the history of racial slavery and the subordination of black people, African slaves, to white people, beginning with the first settlement of the colonies in the early 17th century at the latest. Second, the story of abolition and how it came to pass, both in the United States and in other slave states in the Americas and elsewhere, in an effort to make sense of the different patterns of abolition and emancipation in different countries. And here, I want to, again, congratulate Robert, really, for having the wisdom to have this be a comparative sort of event that looks at the way these processes have worked out in different places and different times. Third, the American Civil War and the place of slaves and of emancipation in that conflict. Why was the Civil War fought? What role did slaves play in the conflict? What was emancipation's role in the war? What were the social, economic, and political consequences of emancipation? Four, the Reconstruction period. What was Reconstruction? What was the meaning of what is the meaning of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and what effect did they have on the lives of freed slaves? How did whites respond to the realities of black political power and efforts at gaining education? Why did Reconstruction come to an end? Fifth, Jim Crow, that is the period of legalized segregation. What were the legal foundations of segregation? They've already been referred to. What social, economic, and political opportunities were available to blacks during the period? What were the patterns of violence against blacks, especially, of course, in the form of lynching? How did the American political system serve or disserve blacks during the years of segregation? Sixth, World War II and its aftermath. How did blacks participate in the American war effort? What was their experience in the U.S. Armed Forces and in the countries in which they served abroad? How did these experiences affect their views of American life? What opportunities did the GI Bill offer, or perhaps more precisely deny, blacks who had served in the military? And how did what Ira Katznelson calls affirmative action for whites actually work? Seventh, how did Brown versus Board of Education, striking down separate but equal public education facilities, affect blacks in American society more broadly? What kinds of efforts were made to integrate public schools? How successful have those efforts been? Eighth, practices such as redlining, that is, denying mortgages to minority applicants, and restrictive covenants, that is, provisions in deeds precluding sale of houses to blacks. These practices have widely excluded blacks from opportunities to purchase homes, the most significant form of wealth held by most Americans. To what extent have such practices driven this disparity in wealth between blacks and whites, and of course other groups as well? Gerrymandering, the gerrymandering of congressional districts and efforts to stem alleged voter fraud are widely regarded as a major limitation on black and other minority political power. How are districts gerrymandered to help ensure racial disparities in political power? How can such practices be curbed? How are efforts to stem voter fraud affecting black and minority rates of electoral participation? 10th, patterns of educational attainment. To what extent are blacks participating in the so-called educational revolution that swept the country since the 1960s? What are their rates of educational success at all levels of the educational system? 11th, patterns of incarceration. I mean, everybody knows that the mass incarceration experiment has been a disaster and vastly disproportionately affecting black and brown people in the United States with far-reaching intergenerational consequences. I mean, obviously, a lot of research has been done on this. 12th, policing. The Black Lives Matter movement arose in response to police beatings and shootings captured by ordinary citizens on cell phones and other devices. Are blacks and other minorities disproportionately mistreated and shot by the police? Some of you may know that an economist at Harvard, Roland Fryer, has found that there's no disproportion in shootings by police, but in all other kind of interactions between police and the public, that there are racial discrimination or inequalities. So that's obviously a matter of dispute. 13, blacks have different rates and incidence of various diseases, lower average rates of life expectancy, and different rates of disability than whites. What accounts for these disparities in health and longevity? How much are the differences a matter of economic inequalities, and how much are they a product of specifically racial differences? 14, blacks suffer disparate rates of violence than whites. What are the causes of these disparities? How do they vary by state and city? To what extent are they a product of the differential availability of guns and to the stringency or laxity of gun laws? 15th, how are blacks integrated in the labor market or not? What sorts of opportunities do they have? What are their prospects as more and more jobs are automated? What remedies will be available for blacks and others who are disadvantaged by changes in the nature of work? And 16th, housing. How do rates of home ownership vary by race? Why do these disparities exist? What is the quality of the dwellings inhabited by people of different races? And what are the patterns, of course, of racial segregation and integration, which have far-reaching implications, particularly for educational opportunities? So that's just a provisional list of the things that it seems to me we need to know. I mean, of course, many of these things are well known among scholars, but not necessarily among ordinary citizens. And I think in order to mobilize some sort of change, more people have to know these things. And frankly, the traditional mass media in the United States are terrible at conveying simple sociological facts, as we saw in the recent presidential election when Donald Trump could claim that crime was out of control, and when in fact it's been going down for 25 years. And so, you know, if most people are getting their news from the evening news, they're being massively misinformed. So my view is that, you know, we need to make this a kind of an official investigation, and then we'll have sort of the imprimatur of the federal government, which ultimately has, you know, is the only entity with the power to make the changes that really need to be made. It seems to me this is a matter of urgent national concern, is long overdue, and is crucial to the creation of a social and political order that meets our highest aspirations as a nation. Clearly, the creation of an investigative commission of this sort is not going to take place overnight. It will require patient organizing, but if it were ever to become a reality, its recommendations would have the seal of approval, so to speak, of the highest legislative body in the land, and the pressure to carry out those recommendations would be substantial. You know, this has often been a difference in different cases, whether or not a reparation action of some sort is something that's decided by, say, the president as opposed to the legislature. And, you know, it makes a big difference what kind of weight these things carry. Many of you will know that something like this took place in the late 1960s in response to the urban unrest in Newark, Detroit, and many other cities around the country. It's universally known as the Kerner Commission, but more formally the National Commission on Civil Disorders undertook a massive study of the causes of those disorders with the idea that they were going to, you know, make those make that kind of thing a thing of the past to fix the reasons that had caused all this unrest. The report appeared, it was supposed to appear March 1st. I think it actually came out February 28th, in part because the President Lyndon Johnson, who had done, frankly, so much for not only for blacks, but of course for the entire country, by creating things like Medicare and the War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But he had gotten involved in sort of an electoral calculation. And he was getting a lot of pressure, of course, about the Vietnam War and that you couldn't prosecute both the Vietnam War and the War on Poverty at the same time, and had heard all kinds of negative things from his perspective at the time about what was going on in the commission, and in any case did not receive it well. In fact, he didn't really receive it formally at all. But that's not to say that this report did not have influence. It sold something like 2 million copies at a time when the population of the United States was rather substantially less than it is now. I guess people used to read books more. Now they read their iPads. But nonetheless, it was a very significant intervention, I think, in American life. The political will to carry out the recommendations that it made, of course, that's another story. But it did make a difference, I think, in people's consciousness of the problems that it addressed. It was quite radical at the time. It basically faulted white racism for the problems that it identified as the causes of the unrest. But it did have the, as I say, the imprimatur of the federal government, of the Congress. And I think that ultimately, that's what we need to have if we're going to make the kinds of changes that will make this a country that's one of racial equality. So thank you very much.
So I'm starting with 20 minutes, is that right? Okay, thank you. All right, so good afternoon. I am privileged to participate in this conference on global perspectives of redress and reparations. Yes, the PowerPoint, thank you. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts from my article, which is entitled When Righteousness Fails, Exploring or the New Moral Economy Incentive for Reparations for African Americans. Thank you. Listening to the presentations this morning, I noted that while each has been focused on a different piece of the complex puzzle of redress and reparations, from different angles as to different nations and different peoples, even in different stages of their effort at gaining some kind of redress. There are some recurring themes that connect all of the efforts towards addressing the impact of slavery and/or genocide. And primary among those themes is the refusal or the resistance of the perpetrator nation to do anything meaningful to actually repair the harm that its actions have caused. And so in the case of the United States, for African Americans, the granting of reparations would first require that the U.S. acknowledge its history of slavery and subsequent systemic discriminatory practices that have resulted in compensable harms to enslaved Africans in America and their descendants. That this is not something that happened in the past that we're trying to address some hundreds of years later, that this what exists today is a legacy of slavery, a legacy of Jim Crow era, a legacy of sustained discriminatory practice, and a system that is built on a mind of oppression, where there is an entire group or groups, but I'm focused on African Americans, there's an entire group that has been just disregarded as less than, and so whatever scraps are thrown their way, they should be grateful for, we should be grateful for, and don't worry about gaining equality, actual equality. So the remedy, right, of reparations, when we talk about what that is, and I teach remedies as part of my package at Campbell, right? It's a multi-component package, right? There may be some monetary component, and that's what people like to focus on, but really to get to the objective, which is to restore African Americans to their rightful citizenry, right, in the United States, there needs to be much more. There needs to be an educational component. There needs to be a business component. There needs to be a healthcare component. There needs to be some power shifting that occurs. There needs to be a dismantling of the system, because the system as it is built on, again, disregard of an entire group of people. So all of these things, right, are what I refer to as reparations. And when I first wrote on reparations some 19 years ago now, I opened that, and I wouldn't have thought that I would be in the exact same place, right, that we were back then. But I opened that piece with this quote from an article that was written by Elizar Barkin. She was then at Columbia University, a professor in international and public affairs. And that, I think I actually have the wrong quote up there. Okay, so that quote, I'll read it, said, "As a world leader emphasizing the need for international relations grounded upon democracy and human rights, the United States has yet to face the dilemma of how to deal with its own past and its most egregious historical injustices, an obvious example being the legacy of slavery." And what struck me about that statement was the succinctness of the truth, that the United States is a champion, right, for democracy most everywhere except within its own borders. And to examine that, and I don't have the time, but we would have to unpack what democracy actually means, right? And it's more than just one vote, you know, one person, one vote, because that's not actually how this system runs. We're an electoral system. But if we look at democracy as being the word that stands in for an actual equal rights society, right? Where everyone has the same rights to expression, to representation, and power is distributed, right? We're certainly not there. So when I talk about when righteousness fails, I'm referring to as failed righteousness the duality of the United States' approach to advancing democracy outside of its borders and within its borders. Within our borders, we live in this ingrained racial caste system, right, that adversely impacts true access to equal and full citizenship. This is something that should just flow from the basic rights and liberties that are derived from societal values that are reflected in the Bill of Rights, right, and in the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment of the Constitution. But sadly, even with the two-term election of America's first black president, Barack Obama, we have been reminded constantly and consistently over the last 8 years, well, actually over the last, 9.5 years now, right, that the problems that flowed from the racial caste system still exist. Mm-hmm. Right? As Barack Obama was the president, we had an increase in overt racism, right, that harken back to the days just after the end of slavery, harken back to the days of Jim Crow era, and it's still going on now, right? So we certainly have to agree that we're not a post-racial society, right? And so on that basis, I begin this current article confident that reparations to African Americans are long overdue, that they are justified, and that the only legitimate questions are, how should reparations to African Americans be framed and implemented, and then who or what will succeed in causing the United States to grant them. In doing this, I'm relying on the vast body of literature and scholarship and the many CERD reports that have documented the connection to slavery and Jim Crow era of how African Americans are oppressed today. So that's my basis, right? That it's not a question of do we need them, that what we need to focus on now is how do we implement them, what are they, what is it going to take to address the harms. That's been documented, right, that there are harms. But how do we do something about them, and who is going to cause the United States to grant them? So in looking at recent concluding observations from the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, right, that was released in August of 2014, all of the indicators of a continuing legacy of slavery documented in my prior article 19 years ago still exist now, right? And they look to the United States' failure to satisfactorily address various areas of racial discrimination, including everything that's bullet pointed there, right? Racist hate crimes, a disparate impact of environmental pollution, race-based obstruction of voting rights happening today, right? We are not progressing, we're rolling back, we're slipping back in large steps, right? And so each of these areas has already been identified as a vestige of slavery in the literature. CERD has identified these as continuing things that need to be addressed to eliminate racial discrimination. And the U.S.'s response to these type of reports, because this wasn't the first one, right, is, well, we have affirmative action, we have the 14th Amendment, we have anti-discrimination laws, not acknowledging that these are all essentially private rights of action, because the government does not, to the greater extent, I mean, I acknowledge that the EEOC exists, but the government does not go after people who violate the rights of African Americans. It is left to individuals to go after their own rights, and because of the way that the judicial system is set up, that is sometimes an uphill battle because of the money that it takes to fund litigation, and at the end of the day, doesn't solve the overall problem because, again, it's a private action, so someone may settle, but it doesn't get rid of the root cause, right? And so being called out on stage for the United States has done nothing. They rely on what they have, and there's no shame, right, in what these findings continue to be. And the question then one would have to ask is why? Why is that? Why won't the U.S. do anything about it? We certainly, if we're being honest, right, we have to admit that the way that this country started and continues today is a direct result of slavery and the mindset that existed in slavery. And so the answer, I argue, is because true reparations are too costly. And I'm not talking about dollars, right? I'm talking about in terms of impact. Because if this was just about money, right? If we could say, all right, we want this amount, write a check or give us a tax deduction that can, pay that amount over a certain amount of years, I'm willing to bet that that would have been done, right? But the problem is that true reparations means an acknowledgement, first of all, that the U.S. Has a serious moral deficiency in the way that it has treated African Americans not just in the past, but today, right? And it would require all of the things that it takes to enable democracy, including not taking away voting rights, but bolstering voting rights, not taking away access to education, but bolstering that. Not only access to education for African Americans, but educating the nation as a whole, right? Putting in the history books, the true history of America, to have young children learn, right, this is what we started from, this was wrong, right, so that you can root out the problematic mentality that is, instead of being, educated out, it's fostered because of the omissions, just in general education, right? We ignore a whole part of the American history because we don't like to talk about that. We start with there was slavery, and then there was, Harriet Tubman, and then, Abraham Lincoln freed everyone, and then we had the Civil Rights Movement, right? So the changes that are necessary are costly. And money isn't enough. The reconstruction of the institution is what is actually necessary. But when we start talking about that, we're talking about taking away a privilege that generations and generations and generations of the white majority feel they're entitled to, because this is just the way it is, and that's how they see America. They don't see, and I realize that I'm generalizing, okay, I'll say that. But many people just don't see a problem that needs to be corrected, right? And part of that issue is the access that a certain amount of us have. But although I am an Ivy League educated law professor, it doesn't stop me from worrying on a daily basis whether my brother, nephew, daughter are going to make it home each day. And the amount of stress, I mean, there's so much to the puzzle, right? It's an interdisciplinary problem that has been examined, right? So just because some people make it doesn't mean the problem doesn't still exist and exist across the board. So in my first piece, I talked about the moral economy incentive for reparations. And this, again, is Elazar Barkin, who talks about the moral economy, in a moral economy, restitution being something that rectifies historical injustices, right? And the crux of this is that to justify reparations and make it happen, more often than not, there's some external pressure that makes it happen. There's an external pressure having to do with economic rights in the international arena that causes a nation to do the right thing, to do the moral thing. And in the case of Black Americans, our problem in getting reparations has been we have no international ally who's pushing for that for us, right? Not one, at least with the economic clout and the political clout, to incentivize the U.S. to do it. In the case of Japanese Americans, what I found in my research was that the desire to trade with Japan really was a driving force in the reparations to Japanese Americans for their internment and the elutes. And yet, if you look at the basis for granting that, right, if you just read that executive order and what it does, you could substitute the word Japanese Americans for African Americans, and the very same justification would apply, right, in 10 times over. And the steps that would be necessary to grant reparations would be the same. It has to be legislative. So this missing international ally to incentivize the U.S. is, in my view, what has been the hurdle. And so I look at this moral economy incentive through the lens of the interest conversion theory that the late Professor Derek Bell talked about as an explanation for why we got mandated desegregation in Brown v. Board of Education, and even why we got the Voting Rights Act to begin with from President Lyndon Johnson. It was not so much that someone suddenly realized that this was wrong and we needed to do something about it, but it was that the doing something about it had the other impact of furthering the interests of the United States in some way, right? And so for the Voting Rights Act, it really was kind of an international face-saving move, right, to stop the airing of the mistreatment that was being aired and broadcast and causing the United States to lose its place as the moral high ground rights leader. And so that today does not seem to be working because in the context of reparations, right, all of the other nations are in the same place, right? And so if we talk about, with the exception of Germany giving reparations and redress to Holocaust victims, right, which the U.S. supported, we have examples that have been talked about this morning of other countries that owe reparations to African Americans not, taking the task on. And so that international pressure is, if anything, to the opposite. It's don't do it, because if you do it, then we'll have to do it, right? So let's just hold steady where we are and maybe they'll forget. And so this, the thought that I have, am I on five? I've passed 5 minutes, the warning? Okay. So the thought that I'm exploring in this article is that the moral economy incentive, or the interest convergence theory right now for reparations is the election of President number 45. And I say that because from where I sit, the results of electing someone who makes no bones about embracing white supremacist mentality, hearkening back to the good old days when we could do X, Y, and Z and handle it this way. A person who on any other day in the nation's history would never have been elected was a direct result of many people who embraced that mentality stepping forward and helping to put him in office. And had the U.S. corrected course years ago and tried to stamp out that mentality, in addition to, you can't stop the way that people think, yes, I realize this, but if we had made it completely unacceptable to still maintain a white supremacist mentality, to still have that play out in police interactions, to still have that play out in the judicial system, to still have it play out in all aspects, economic, healthcare, that we talk about about needing to address by reparations, then perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation today. But since we are, right, now the interest can be, well, this person is in office and doing things that actually may work to the detriment of the country, right, on a level that has nothing to do with race, right? If we look at healthcare and the actions at rolling back something that has really benefited most Americans, the Obamacare program. If we look at the rollback of EPA regulation, right, and how that affects not just the African Americans who have historically been targeted with environmental discrimination, if you will, but everyone now, right, if we're going to take away the regulations that have been in place. I could keep going down the list. This works to the detriment of the country as a whole and may do something more than just harm the U.S.'s stature as, having a moral high ground. We've pretty much, lost that battle, and the U.S. hasn't cared. But I think that it still cares about being a world leader when it comes to driving policy, and that is my time. Thank you.
Do we have a moderator, or are we moderating ourselves? It's always dangerous. Can I just say something? I just want to, again, I really appreciate everybody's, comments, and I find myself always pulling things together. I mean, what my colleague here was saying about the Kerner Commission, I was thinking, he's kind of talking about the Kerner Commission and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of merging. And if you merge that with what I was saying, when I said cells, I didn't mean, I kind of said that to scare everybody, but what I meant was something that are called study circles. They've been pioneered in Sweden, they've been used for adult education. The Swedes carried on a national conversation. 2/3 of the Swedes over the age of 18 have participated in these things. And they had a conversation, for example, about whether or not Sweden should enter the common market that was run through the study circles. I mean, like, again, 2/3 of the Swedes over the age 18 participated in this. So you combine that with the kind of the new history things and all of that. For the kids, great, but the adults need to be part of this conversation as well. How do you get to a moral economy? And how do we get to what you're talking about? I would say that it's through direct democracy. The study circles model is actually connected with something that Jefferson talked about called ward republics. He actually stole the idea from the Native Americans. I mean, I introduced the idea of ward republic because Jefferson's ward republics idea as having been conveyed to me by one of his black descendants. That's where I got around, quoting Jefferson on this. But it turns out he took it from the Iroquois. These are concentric circles of groups of about 15 to 20 people. And once you link them, each study circle nominates someone to represent them in a circle that represents more people. So like, say you had a study circle, many circles of 10, and each one of them selects somebody to sit on a council of 10. So now you've got 100 people, then 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. And it replicates geometrically. It's very, very powerful. And we keep going through, like, what I call this imagined reality thing, that we can come up with a great idea that emerges from a small, intimate conversation, and that we can somehow get millions of people to buy into it. I think the only way they buy into it on the level that we're talking about is if they engage it personally with someone who they respect, and someone who's who they have confidence in. But what you're talking about, really, what both of you guys are talking about, is reconstruction. I mean, doing it again, doing it right. Obviously, in these circumstances today, it would be done in black communities. Then you have questions about all the African Americans who have left that community. Would they come back? Would they be part of that, that process? But I think reconstruction, in terms of the folks, the people of the African descent in the United States who are most vulnerable, they are in predominantly black communities. One of the things that I talked about in my article is something I call reparations academies. That is, kind of places where teachers would be trained to do the best for African American kids, in schools, throughout the state, and one in each state that would be, kind of funded by that. But those are just some of the thoughts that came up.
Any questions or any comments from the audience? Okay. Because I think we talked a lot. Okay. There are three people had their hands up.
Anna first, and then,
Yeah, let's just work our way around.
Now it's my time to pronounce our name, but
Ajua.
Ajua. Then, because I use your work and so on, but we read, but we are not speaking. My question, I am really very glad for your presentation because it's the first time that I had the perspective of people working on this case of Georgetown descendants. I heard some of the descendants as well, but they were in the setting of, they were at Georgetown during that ceremony last May.
Yeah, the liturgy.
And exactly, then this is a completely different setting to discuss the issue. And I was very glad to know that a couple of weeks ago, they brought, because until the end of the last year, when I finished the book, in the conclusion, I have some comments on that, on the fact that it was only offered symbolic reparations. And just a few weeks ago, for the first time, they made a statement saying that symbolic reparations were not enough. Then I was very glad to hear the perspective that you were bringing, because I am in Washington, D.C., I see the historians who are in that commission, and this is what is the problem also of academics being part of these initiatives, is that when you work in these institutions, how you can be critical to what is being done. Mm-hmm. And I heard several of them, and they never questioned the fact, for example, that a commission was created, but none of the descendants are represented in the commission. Mm-hmm. Then I am very glad to, and I would like to have much more, to know much more about what is being done on that. A question that I have to you regarding then the Jesuits, is there any record about these Jesuit priests? I know that it's very hard to have such kind of record, but in Latin America it's not. That had children, offspring with this, with one of those enslaved people that they own. Is there any record here that associated with people who were sold by Georgetown whose fathers were these priests? Because they were well known to have children with everybody, and of course enslaved women could be also the case, which complicates more the case that you were talking about.
We don't know of, I don't know of any record. Richard Cellini is doing the Memory Project, and he's doing research, and hopefully that's, I know that's one of the areas he's looking into. There's no documentation yet, but that is something we've talked about, and others have raised with us your very point. So I know he is doing, hopefully looking at it more deeply. So if we get it, I'll let you know.
Thank you very much for all of your suggestive presentation, but my reaction is simple. I'm still puzzled about how to mobilize the reparations movement in this divided, fragmented society under the Trump administration. John mentioned his pessimistic vision in the future in this field in his previous article. And I think in the American legal scholarship, the number of the reparation article is decreasing compared to the early 2000s. And the Japanese, as I talk to you tomorrow, the Japanese situation is much worse. And the Japanese youngsters, most of them are just indifferent to this topic due to the decrease of historical education by the present administration. So compared to the Japanese situation, the micro reparations from the grassroots level, such as the Georgetown case, must be better than the Japanese situation. So Could you explain a little bit? Elaborate more about
I mean,
the
the
action.
Georgetown case may be, you know, a good thing that it's happening, but, you know, you ask about the climate more generally, which is more as Professor Chisholm has described. It's, you know, we're moving backward on all kinds of fronts, but particularly on the front of racial equality. You know, when you think about voter ID laws and that sort of thing that are basically, everybody understands this is an attempt to limit minority voting participation. There's no other justification for it. There's never been any fraud that's actually been found, right? So it's clear that what's going on, and those things are kind of moving forward. Look, I mean, there's a part of me that's pessimistic about the whole thing, the whole idea of racial equality in the United States. I mean, in my darker moments, I think Tocqueville was right about, you know, the fact that this is never going to work out. But it does seem to me that there have been times when, you know, achievements have been made, there have been improvements. We did just, you know, twice elect an African-American president. So it can't be all one, you know, story of white supremacy unbroken with no possibility for improvement. If that were the case, then I don't see why we'd really be here, you know, having this conversation. So, you know, I tend towards the pessimistic overall, but I think, you know, things can be done, and this kind of thing, this kind of discussion is part of that effort, so.
If I could just add on to that. So I note that in addition, the universities engaging in some historic roots reflection and taking some kinds of action, centers for slavery and this and that, coupled with more of an effort to financially foster diversity at the universities is one thing that's happening on the private spectrum. But many, many years ago, a few states actually granted reparations to African Americans in connection with things like the Tulsa riots and the Wall Street burning. And so, and that was, again, many, many years ago. And I think that perhaps if you've noted a decline in academic scholarship on reparations, it's because everything that could, you know, possibly have been said about why we need it, and maybe what it should look like. There's still some more to be said, but it starts stalling, right, if it looks like we're getting nowhere in actually having implementation. And so I think that the focus, to the extent anyone is really, you know, energetic about writing, has to be how do we make it happen? While interdisciplinary, we're looking at what is it going to look like, right? It has to be how do we make it happen? And so I like the idea of this concentric circles, you know, of direct democracy, because if it's the people, right, who are going to drive this happening, then we have to start with how we decide our, you know, area representatives, you know, are elected and who are they going to be. That's how we decide who gets to Congress and the Senate and the state and federal level, and that's how we have some control if those people are actually responsive to the needs of their constituents. And that's how I think that's a good example of how to get there, as opposed to the game playing that goes on. Maybe that's how we can change, you know, the setting to drive this change that we need to see happen.
Just a tad note, I wrote an article a few years ago, I think it was just a few years ago, on why reparations is essential for democracy. And I think that that's part of that's the way I looked at it, that if we don't have reparations, we do not have a true democracy. And so that might be a way of, you can look at that.
There's a funny cartoon that's been kind of circulating. I've shown it to a couple of people. It's a picture of a probably low-income white guy in his kind of shack, kind of cowering back there, and he's got all these guns. And there's a picture of the GOP elephant kind of creeping away from the house, and it says to him, "Watch out for those Democrats coming to get your guns." And he's carrying two bags. One of them says Medicare, the other one says Social Security. So, you know, when you're talking about the moral economy and how it's, central and stuff like that. Part of the conversation I think that has to be had through these circles is this really in your best interest to let this continue? Because if they're fooling us, don't you think they're coming for you also?
James Baldwin.
Yep.
There was another question?
He's got him.
Yeah. We have a majority of Caucasians in power, and they have their power as an accident of their birth, that they happen to be born Caucasians. And I think there's a lot of the fact that Trump is in office is people are, many whites are afraid of losing their power, and that the people who are unskilled have concerns that they won't have the privilege of having jobs merely because they're white, the accident of their birth. And people who are wealthy, on the other hand, particularly conservative, have this notion that their success is a result of only of their hard work. And I mean, most of us have gone to the trouble of going to law school, and it's been difficult for us to become lawyers, so we take pride in, we're successful. We went to the trouble of getting a law degree and those kinds of things, but we don't recognize to what extent that our success is attributable to the fact that, in my case, I'm a white, I'm male, my parents loved me, and they wanted the best for me, and many of us, many people in those circumstances don't fully appreciate how much an advantage in having been born to a particular womb made those things possible. And for children who were born to poor parents that didn't love them or didn't care for them, start out at the entry gate at a severe disadvantage, and it affects them for the rest of their lives. And until, as individuals, we can come to terms with the luck of our success, for those who have been successful, and for those who haven't been, that their envy of black people taking their place because, and that they're advantaged only because they happen to be white. Until those things are changed, I think it's going to be difficult for us to appreciate the value of not only reparation for racial minorities, but for poor people generally, and for all those people who are disadvantaged, from the beginning of their birth.
Can I respond first? First of all, I want to give an example of one of the things Tim Wise and others have written on is white privilege, right? And that if we're really going to have, and I'm extrapolating a little bit to reparations, then whites have to be at least willing, and maybe made to, but at least willing to give up a privilege that most whites are not willing to give up. But that's one of the privileges. Being white, there is a privilege. I'm going to give one example. I taught before I retired. Retirement is wonderful. I taught critical race theory, and I had a student, white guy from Arkansas, who followed every class I taught, he took. And I have no idea why that guy liked my teaching that much, because a lot of them didn't like my teaching at all, right? But every class I took, he took. And I'm sure all of us have students like that just kind of follow us, right? So he took critical race theory. And so we had one section that year was on white privilege. And he said, "Oh, Professor Arturo, I just don't believe in white privilege. I'm a poor white boy from rural Arkansas, very, very poor. I have not had any privilege. I've just been struggling. My family has struggled all their lives." To his credit, and I say that very sincerely, he took that topic as his paper topic. And that takes a lot, for a student to say, okay, I'm going to write on it. But of course, when he took it, I'm sure he thought, I'm going to show her, right? So he took it. His class presentation, he started it by saying, I was wrong. He studied white privilege. And he saw in his sincere study of it, not some, I've had students kind of want to prove their theory so they don't really research it thoroughly until you push them, right? He said, Professor, this material is correct. There is a benefit to the whiteness of the skin, a benefit that crosses economic levels and everything. And so to the extent that, and I disagree with you about reparations for poverty, but that's another topic. But I do think that to the extent that we really want to address reparations in this country, that white people have to be willing to not just speak it, not just say, oh, I agree, I think, what happened in slavery was awful, what happened in Jim Crow was awful, what happened, and be able to admit, and I have a privilege, just merely by the whiteness of my skin, and I am willing to put that privilege on the table in order to arrive at what I don't call racial equality, I call racial justice. Until we can do that, we will not have racial justice. I'm not sure what we mean by racial equality, but I know we won't. What I've been striving for, all the work I've been doing, is for justice, racial justice. But white people, I love that white people come. I have, whites I engage with all the time. I mean, I will say what whites used to say to us, some of my best friends are white, right? You say some of my best friends are black. But I do think that we have to take that seriously. Otherwise, to me, and I mean no disrespect, to me, the presence of white people in these discussions isn't sincere. If you're not willing to give up something for embracing reparations and racial justice.
Could I just kind of add something to that, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm not sure that I'm opposed to reparations for poverty. One of the things that I want to kind of point out is that Marilyn French, who's a feminist, and I used her stuff. One of the things that she says is that the principle of subordination ramifies endlessly. I think one of the things you have to understand as a white male, okay, I mean, I'm going to talk to you now because she was talking to you. You have to understand that your privilege carries with it a subordination. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, white and black are made-up categories. Mm-hmm. It's made up. People in Africa don't think of themselves as black. They're Twi or Ashanti or something like that. But the very notion of white and black are tools of subordination. And they are tools of subordination not only of black people but of white people as well. If the idea that you are, and I'm not saying, now I'm not just talking about you individually, generally, the idea that a white person has been made to feel superior to a black person is totally fictional. But the fact that you believe it enables the person who has created that construct to manipulate you as well. And when I said this whole thing about the Social Security and the Medicare being taken away because, watch out, they're going to take your guns. Meanwhile, we're taking everything that you have. The whole point about the moral economy is that look where we're going to wind up. I mean, what's happening to the wealth of this country? It's disappearing into the pockets of some very, very wealthy people. And that is not an accident. If you're dumb enough to swallow the myth of racial superiority, you're dumb enough to swallow anything. So the point is the conversation that we need to have, the direct democracy conversation we need to have is about that. It may be that black people, because we have been so sufficiently and sharply subordinated by the system, maybe we feel it, maybe we're the minus canary, maybe we're the ones who are bringing this thing up. But believe me, it's not just us, it's everybody. And when people understand that, then we can have a conversation.
Good point.
So just quickly, I'll add that this concept isn't new, right? This was the discussion that was starting to happen right before Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? So I'll just say that the construct of reparations for African Americans requiring kind of a dismantling of the system could be viewed as, well, would actually result in actual equal citizenry for everyone, right? And anytime there's a black movement for civil rights, it benefits everyone, right? And even more so than it does the black people who are suffering for it. But if we looked at it that way, right, then we could start to get people on board, right? But we can't take, in my view, we can't take the black label off of it, right? We can't afford to take the 4 African Americans off of it, because as soon as we do that, the focus gets dissipated, and the harms that we're talking about that really need to be rectified don't get rectified. They get compromised and negotiated away for the greater good of, the whole crowd, as opposed to addressing what it is. But the buy-in, I think, can come from that concept.
I want to make it clear, I wasn't advocating
Oh,
that.
no.
Yeah.
I understand.
I'm just saying that the other constituencies need to step up.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
I guess maybe I should just say something and not in conclusion, but, I appreciate your comments, and it reminded me, you may recall Elizabeth Warren's comment to an entrepreneur who, had made a lot of money, and she was like, that's great, but you shipped goods on roads that we all paid for, got an education that, we all paid for. All these things came to people because of, investments that we made in common citizenship. And that's something I really want to applaud in your comments about the way in which this is, to me, I'm very old-fashioned, is that I think of this business of equality, if you like, as an outgrowth of the idea of a common citizenship. And since these categories, as Mr. McDougall has just pointed out, are kind of made up, you never know which side of the line you're going to fall on. So really what you want to do is create the best that you can do for anybody who might be in that situation. It's like John Rawls's Behind the Veil of Ignorance. You don't know, what you're going to look like, what you're going to be, where you're going to be born. So you want to create a society that is as good as possible, given that ignorance, essentially, about where you're going to end up in that system. So I think basically, to me, this is all a project of common citizenship and has to be emphasized really as a goal of, what it means to live in a democratic society.
So with that, we have a break. We're a little bit over time, but so I'd like to thank our panel and.
Okay, folks, we're going to get started with our final panel of the day. Which, as I said earlier, is the complicity panel. And unfortunately, Ann Farrow could not be here. So, Saru, are you going to be able to read her paper for us?
I will try.
Great. So we start with Professor Darity and Mullen, Kristen Mullen. I'm sorry. So Professor Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the Director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. I think that's probably the longest title I've seen in a long time. And his presentation is going to be given in conjunction with a presentation by Professor Mullen. Who is the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas to conduct short-term residency. residencies, excuse me. She was a member of the International Free Lawn Ajay Bond Concept Development Team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution Commission to design and construct the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So maybe you're the person I need to talk to get into the museum. Those are hard tickets to come by. We also have Shalina Ray on this panel. She's a visiting lecturer at the University of Alabama School of Law, and she's the co-author, along with Professor Alfred Brophy, who's unable to be here because he's at another conference. But they've written a paper on transitional justice, and that's one of the themes that we'd like to pursue at the conference. So I'm going to just turn it over to the panel.
Thank you very much. Special thanks to Professor Wesley for this invitation to join you today. So regarding those tickets, so in April, the museum is actually going to start offering some ticketless days. And they're probably going to be Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So if you're not already on their email list, get on there so that you can find that out. But it's coming. It's coming. All right. I'd like to say thank you, too, to John Torpy, whose 16-item list of particulars justifying reparations effectively announces the book my partner, William Sanidari, and I were commissioned to write for the University of North Carolina Press, From Here to Equality, Reparations for African Americans in the 21st Century. All right. So, my timer here. So I'm going to try to be close to on time. Very good. All right. So I want to talk about who benefited from slavery, particularly the benefits to the northern states, the unmerited privileges that flowed from slavery to white Americans, and what actions colleges, universities, and individuals with a connection to slavery should take as acts of atonement. I will also speak to this notion of slavery's, quote, long ago past, end quote. Many opponents of reparations focus their attacks exclusively on slavery, citing its long ago past as a primary reason to dismiss any contemporary claims to redress. The conversation on universities' responsibilities has focused almost exclusively on slavery. We argue that there is a much wider set of ramifications of the actions universities have taken and continue to maintain, not the least of which is the long years of the exclusion of black students and faculty. In their exceptional publication, Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, and Farrell, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank trace the trade beginning in 1641, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony legally recognized the institution of slavery. Virginia was already a slave trading site at that time, but Massachusetts was the first to sanction servitude. Supplying provisions for these slaves and for the vast plantations in the Caribbean and in South America required the efforts of a staggering number of financiers, merchants, lawyers, insurers, shippers, real estate brokers, auctioneers, and laborers. One example of a new market driven by the slave trade was the colonial shipbuilding industry, an international network of shipwrights, sailmakers, barrel makers, lumberjacks, carvers, engravers, machinists, blacksmiths, iron workers, silversmiths, tool makers, mechanics, gunsmiths, and ammunitions manufacturers kept the ocean-going ships and crews that transported captured Africans to the booming markets in the Americas afloat. From the docks of Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, a round robin of outgoing ships carrying dairy products, fish, and rum followed vessels unloading slaves, sugar, and molasses. The export of goods, especially exports to the West Indies and to plantations in the American South, made possible the dramatic expansion of commerce in New England, the purchase of luxury goods from Europe, financial security, and a lifestyle of leisure unavailable up to this time. And because all commercial roads led to the slave trade, one need not actually have owned slaves to profit from the trafficking of black bodies. Newspapers like the Hartford, Connecticut Courant, which was founded in 1764, before the nation itself existed and is still being published, profited from the sale of advertisements supporting the sale and capture of slaves, adverts for slave ship crews, the provisioning of slave ships and plantations, and the sale of slave-made goods. Aetna is one of a host of insurance companies that provided coverage for slave ships and their cargoes. At least 5,000 slaves were insured in Connecticut in 1790, and according to Lang, most of the state's formidable institutions enslaved at least one African. Indeed, there were plantations throughout Connecticut, and while they were generally referred to as farms, the scale of these enterprises and the numbers of their slave personnel would have marked them as plantations had they been in the American South, the Caribbean, or in South America. Slave-grown cotton was the national currency that seeded the growth of American cities before the Civil War. Between 1821 and 1860, New York City, a major importer of cotton, became the nation's and the world's largest commercial and financial center with the aid of this good. Failed investment bank Lehman Brothers began as a cotton brokerage in Montgomery, Alabama in 1850 and would become the state of Alabama's fiscal agent. The company's founder, Henry Lehman, immigrated from Rimpar, Germany to Montgomery in 1844, and together with his brothers Emanuel and Meyer, went into the commodities brokerage business, constructed a cotton storage warehouse, and became the area's largest buyers and sellers of cotton. After Reconstruction, they moved their operations to New York City, and in 1870 spearheaded the formation of the New York Cotton Exchange, the first commodities futures trading venture. Meyer Lehman was appointed to its first board of directors. So Sandy and I were walking last night in the city downtown, and we passed the New Orleans Cotton Exchange on Carondelet, which was founded in 1871, a time when a third of all cotton production flowed through New Orleans. Real estate and shipping tycoon John Jacob Astor made his fortune in furs, the Chinese opium trade, and transporting cotton to the world's ports. Jeweler Charles Louis Tiffany, who opened the flagship Tiffany shop in New York City on Broadway Street in 1837 with capital from his father, Comfort Tiffany, whose fortune had been derived from the operation of a cotton manufacturing company in what would become Danielsonville, Connecticut. New York City was booming in the late 1830s, largely because of the cotton trade. Archibald Gracie Jr., the son of Scottish international shipper Archibald Gracie of Grace Mansion fame, left New York City to become a cotton broker in Mobile, Alabama. The cotton-producing states were integrally connected to the fortunes of New Yorkers. Historian Bernard Balin affirms that feeding and clothing the millions of slaves working the sugar plantations throughout the Americas was big business, and the income from these enterprises enriched New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Slave-grown cotton made the expansion of the area's textile mills possible, some 472 institutions in 1860. One Connecticut town, Thompson, was home to 7 mills. During the decades 1830 to 1840, New England mills processed in excess of 100 million pounds of cotton grown in the South. By 1860, 10 major cotton-producing states in the South, home to 2.3 million enslaved Africans living on 75,000 cotton plantations, produced 66% of the world's cotton, which accounted for more than half of all U.S. exports. Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, and Belgium were all dependent upon U.S. slave-grown cotton. At least 2 Connecticut towns were built on the global production and milling of African-based ivory, clearly an industry that would not have existed without the slave trade. I'm going to skip talking a bit about Katrina Brown's film, Tracing the Trade, and her cousin Thomas Norman DeWolf's book, Inheriting the Trade. But the Browns were, by a great measure, the largest dealers in the slave trade in the Americas, the DeWolf family. And hiring captains and crews throughout New England. They participated in some 1,000 plus voyages that brought over 100,000 captives to the Americas. And even after the trade was illegal, they continued to ply their trade because they were on speaking terms with Thomas Jefferson, who wink, wink said, continue. It'll be fine. We and others, including historian Lorenzo Johnson Green, the author of The Negro in Colonial New England, 1620 to 1776, contend that slavery was not contained in the American South, and the economic effects of slavery were far from limited to the South. Historian Ronald Bailey extends Green's work in his article, The Slave Trade and the Development of Capitalism in the United States, the Textile Industry in New England. It's time to accept our nation's tortured past for what it was, an immoral and cruel reality. The destruction of African families and clans was a key element in the wealth equation for America. African lives are the foundation upon which this nation was built. As African families were being torn apart, fortunes derived from the slave trade facilitated the growth of white families through unprecedented rates of natural reproduction. With incomes on the rise and cash and credit readily available, Americans were finding it possible to marry at younger ages and begin to expand their families. I would like to rebut briefly the often lodged charge that, quote, slavery was so long ago, there is no reason to keep bringing it up. From a generational perspective, American slavery was not that long ago. Ended in 1865, now 150 years. If a new generation comes into existence every 30 years, the youngest generation is the 5th generation since the end of slavery, on average. But in some families, the generational distance is much narrower. In my mother's family, I, Kirsten Mullen, am a member of the 4th generation since slavery. Following my mother, Avis Ann Mullen, her mother, Harriet Tolliver Mitchell, who died 5 years ago, and Harriet's father, Walker Tolliver, who was born in slavery. From my earliest childhood memories, I heard stories about Walker, a minister who was born in Caroline County, Virginia, and his wife, Hattie. Portraits of the couple hang in my mother's house. On my father's side, there's my father, James Otis Mullen, his father, Otis Mullen, Otis's father, Delu Mullen, and Delu's mother, Sally, whose parents had been enslaved by her common-law husband's family, with whom she had 7 children. Otis Mullen said, when presented with our son Aiden, his great-grandchild, not long after our son's birth, that Aiden was the 5th generation. Kenneth Lewis, candidate for U.S. Senate for North Carolina in 2008, is the great-grandson of a slave. The Black Caldwell family with connections to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is another family with a grandfather who was born to slavery. My partners, William Darity Jr.'s maternal great-grandparents were born enslaved. So, moving quickly now to the subject of the actions colleges, universities, and individuals with a connection to slavery should take as acts of atonement. In a May 2017 report from Black Perspectives, we learn about Stephen A. Douglas, a Mississippi planter who enslaved over 180 Black people between 1848 and 1857. Douglas, whose maltreatment of the human chattel that he, quote, half-fed and clothed, end quote, and subjected to, quote, inhuman and disgraceful treatment, end quote, was deemed so repugnant that white Mississippians labeled him, quote, a disgrace to all slaveholders and the system that they support. Disgrace or no, when Douglas offered 10 acres of land to establish the University of Chicago, estimated at $1.2 million in today's currency, the school's founding trustees gladly accepted his gift and leveraged it to obtain a loan of $6 million to construct the campus, and by 1881, had developed an extensive network of donors and created a $4 million endowment. Several dozen colleges and universities have researched their slave pasts. We talked already today about Brown University, which resolved to erect a memorial, launched a series of public programs to, quote, help the community reflect on the history of slavery in Rhode Island, and to, quote, augment its curriculum to making a strong commitment to use some of its resources in the service of the children of Providence. Harvard unveiled a plaque on Wadsworth House honoring 4 women and men, Bilhah, Venus, Titus, and Juba, who it enslaved during the 18th century. In 2011, Emory hosted what may have been the first conference on the web of connections that binds American universities to the trade in Black bodies. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill created an extensive website exhibition on its involvement with the trade. Slaveholder John Hogan donated 200 acres to the university and was awarded a contract to have his enslaved Blacks produce the bricks for, quote, Old East, the campus's beloved first building. University of Virginia, Charlottesville commissioned a memorial on the Commons, a circular stone wall that, quote, rises from an open green area that will bear the names of black men and women who were forced to, quote, build and sustain the institution. Its diameter echoes that of the campus rotunda, designed by Thomas Jefferson, a spokesman said with pride, during their recent University Slavery, Public Memory, and the Built Environment Symposium. The University of Alabama apologized to the descendants of enslaved blacks owned by or leased to the school, placed markers near the grave sites of two of its human chattel. This past February, University of South Carolina, Columbia erected a bronze statue to Richard T. Greener, its first African-American professor. Greener, Harvard's first phenotypically black graduate, was admitted to USC's law school in 1873. And much has been made of the Georgetown University case. Some 272 captive blacks owned by Jesuit priests were sold to pay in 1838 to pay the school's creditors. Audra has very covered this territory in some detail. We know that the Georgetown renamed one building after Isaac Hawkins, who was enslaved, and another for Anne Marie Beecraft Hall, a free woman of color who had founded a school for black girls near the school. There was a rumor that the university had decided to offer free tuition to the descendants of the 272 enslaved blacks that it sold. We did some back-of-the-envelope calculations and determined that there may be as many as 6,912 living descendants who would be eligible to attend Georgetown. What the university actually offered the living descendants, however, was preferential treatment in admission, something akin to what legacies currently receive. If the university decided to offer free tuition to those 6,900 individuals, I would be the first to salute their effort. Still, that is not reparations. Like the apologies for slavery issued by a handful of state legislatures, we view these kinds of efforts as piecemeal and insufficient. A satisfactory reparations program would constitute an attack on the wealth gap, and these kinds of measures would leave it relatively intact. In April 2017, during the Liturgy of Remembrance, Contrition, and Hope it created, Georgetown President John J. DeGioia said, quote, "Slavery remains the original sin of our republic, an evil that our university was complicit in, a sin that tore families apart," end quote. So what role should universities play in the advancement of the effort to achieve reparations for all black Americans? In his impeccably researched Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's University, Craig Stephen Wilder documents the nation's elite schools' inextricable ties to slavery. The trade in black bodies and decades of coerced labor enabled the schools to grow and dominate. One of the key outlets for the merchant class's philanthropic contributions was support for the fledgling American universities. Not only did elite academic institutions fight abolition efforts, they pushed the pro-slavery agenda. Indeed, one of the most potent activities among America's professoriates was crafting the ideological case for slavery as a beneficial system of social stratification, establishing black inferiority and slavery as an appropriate school for civilization or essential mechanism of behavioral control for black savagery was a major academic enterprise. For example, the notion that blacks had the smallest cranial capacity of any, quote, racial group, end quote, and therefore were cognitively inferior, was a product of both Northern and Southern scholarship. In closing, building statues is hardly enough. We believe elite colleges and universities should lead the charge for reparations and use their considerable influence and prestige to argue persuasively for the end of racial discrimination and wealth and income inequality. Thank you.
As Kirsten suggested, the racial wealth gap is a signal indicator of the cumulative effects of white supremacy. And indeed, it is the racial wealth gap that should be the target for identification of the effectiveness of a reparations program. The strongest case for reparations is probably anchored in the post-slavery period, especially because of the failure to move the formerly enslaved to full citizenship and full access to the economic opportunities customarily available to non-Black Americans. We have a mythology about processes of wealth accumulation by individuals and households in the United States. We usually attribute wealth accumulation to deliberate and systematic personal acts of savings. But the major source of wealth in the United States for individuals and for households are intergenerational transfers of resources. These take two forms, either inheritances, that is the transfer that occurs when the donor has died, or what we call colloquially in the economics literature, in vivo transfers. These are transfers that take place while the donor is living. Another way of describing in vivo transfers is gifts. People frequently don't think of certain types of gifts as constituting intergenerational transfers of resources, but one example might be parents providing resources for a child to actually attend college or university. In fact, what that would do is reduce the amount of debt that the child would be confronted with at the end of their university period. A lot of folks assume that that's something that should automatically be provided by parents, and I think most parents are willing to do so, although we're going to see something interesting about that in a moment. Most parents are willing to do so if they have the capacity. So if it's in vivo transfers and inheritances that lie at the core of the initial capacity to accumulate wealth, then we have to ask ourselves, why is it that Black Americans typically have considerably less to transfer to the next generation? And the answer originates in the destruction of Reconstruction. So in the process of eliminating Reconstruction as it was initially conceived, Black Americans were denied the promised 40 acres and a mule. This is a land allocation that I would argue is not symbolic, but it's a substantive foundation for wealth. And secondly, they were denied access to the ballot. Political exclusion reigned supreme in the aftermath of white terror campaigns to drive blacks away from participation in the political process. This was compounded by massacres that took place involving the destruction of black lives and property in towns and cities ranging from Coushatta and Colfax, Louisiana, to Danville, Virginia, to Wilmington, North Carolina, to a host of cities both north and south in the bloody summer of 1919, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Rosewood, Florida, to Chicago, Illinois, to Detroit, Michigan. In addition, the white terror campaigns were accompanied by a lynching trail. Today, that lynching trail, which was typically engaged in by public mobs, called these events, frequently they called them parties, that lynching trail has been supplanted by a wave of police lynchings that are directed against unarmed blacks. But the lynching trail was also associated, in many cases, with the seizure of property of the individual who was killed. So once again, there was a loss of accumulated wealth. This was further reinforced by the indignity of separate facilities under the regime of legal segregation, which also translated into segregation in residential patterns in the United States, which also affected both equity and general access to home ownership. And finally, I'd like to make mention at this point of certain public policies that promoted wealth for whites in the United States but did not do so for blacks. I'm thinking specifically of the ways in which the federal home loan program was administered, as well as the GI Bill. This is what's frequently now referred to as affirmative action for white people. So the result of this process, this historical process, is one in which we now observe massive differences in levels of wealth between blacks and whites. I want to emphasize that I'm talking about wealth and not income. The wealth is the difference between the value of what you own and what you owe, or the difference between the value of your assets and your debts. It's an estimated measure of the total value of your personal property. It's something that you can carry with you across time or draw upon in times of special need or special emergency. It also is a store of opportunity that's not associated with the flow of resources that comes from income. And for most Americans, income is generated by their earnings. So what's the magnitude of the wealth gap? Well, in the 2014 Survey of Income and Program Participation, the median black household had 7 cents to every $1 of net worth held by the median white household. Whites collectively own 96% of the nation's wealth, while blacks own approximately 2% of the nation's total wealth. White households that are in or near poverty have about $15,000 in median net worth, while black households have a median net worth, among those black households that are in or near poverty, have a median net worth of 0. If you were to look at the other end of the wealth distribution, the black family that's in the 99th percentile of the wealth distribution, the upper 1% of black wealth holders have about $1.57 million in net worth at the median. But if you look at the white family that's in the upper 1% of the white wealth distribution, their median net worth is about $12 million. So these are huge, huge differences. And so one of the things that I want to explore with you today is the question about the ways in which we've constructed narratives about the sources of these differentials. And I propose that the major source of the differential is the incapacity of previous generations of black Americans to transfer large sums of resources to subsequent generations. But there's a narrative that's quite pervasive. There's a narrative that's quite pervasive in the current moment that suggests that there's a different explanation, and this alternative explanation is one that I view as a major obstacle towards the promotion of a program of reparations. And this is a narrative of black dysfunction. It essentially asserts that the reason why we observe these massive differences in wealth between blacks and whites is because blacks have failed to take personal responsibility and to behave in ways in which they could promote the improvement of their family or individual wealth positions. And one of these arguments in the black dysfunction narrative is a claim that blacks have an oppositional posture towards education. This is, of course, a very, very peculiar claim, given the forcefulness with which black families and black parents have tried to pursue education for their children. But let's look at some specific data that clearly runs in contrast or contradiction to the black oppositional attitude towards education. So the first piece of evidence I'd like to offer is the evidence that for a given household's socioeconomic status, black youths get more years of schooling and more credentials than white youths. Second piece of evidence, black parents who make contributions to their children's higher education have 1/3 of the median net worth of white parents who make no contribution to their children's higher education. And moreover, when blacks are successful in achieving higher levels of education, it does not translate into any significant reduction in the racial wealth gap. So, blacks with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of whites who never finished high school. Okay. A second argument is that, well, blacks are profligate, so they don't save enough. Okay. And this is the argument that I guess we spend all our income on Nike shoes and the like. Okay. Cadillacs, yeah. Well, nobody, oh, well, Escalades are out of style now, but okay, yeah. But yes. So actually, there are two responses I want to give here, counter evidence as well. The first is the evidence from a study by Norman Gittleman and Ed Wolf, in which they demonstrate that if you control for household income, essentially there's no significant difference between black and white savings rates. And in fact, the black savings rate is mildly higher in some income categories. A more recent study that was conducted by IASP at Brandeis University indicates that whites spend 1.3 times as much as blacks out of comparable incomes. So if anything, it's blacks who are living a more austere existence than whites in a country where very few people do much savings anyway. Okay. Third argument is, well, blacks are not motivated to work hard enough. But of course, if we're thinking about the racial wealth gap, blacks working full-time have a lower net worth than unemployed whites. Another argument that's typically made in the black dysfunction column is a claim that there are family structure reasons why blacks have less wealth. The failure of blacks to form traditional or conventional two-parent families somehow is the source of the racial wealth gap. So the first observation I'd like to make here is that the causation is running in the wrong direction. It's the adverse economic conditions that lead to particular patterns of family structure. We will find high incidences of single-parent families in all communities of people who are confronted with high degrees of poverty and deprivation. Okay? But secondly, even when black folks get the ideal family structure, it doesn't have a significant effect on closing the racial wealth gap. So the median household with a single white parent has 2.2 times the wealth of the median household with two black parents. Okay. Fifth, people argue that what's really needed is improved financial literacy. That you need to teach black folks how to handle their money. Okay. Well, first point I'd like to make here is that without any initial endowment to manage and build upon, financial training is useless. Or the other way I want to put this is that financial literacy without any finance is a meaningless act. So, and furthermore, financial literacy doesn't immunize anyone from fraud, which is probably the greater danger. And I think of the Bernie Madoff case, in which I don't think anyone would claim that his clients were financially illiterate. Okay. And then final point I want to make is that there's absolutely no evidence that blacks actually are less knowledgeable or less sensible about managing their funds than whites. It's just typically the case that blacks have much, much less to manage and much less of a cushion in the event that a bad decision is made. Final argument that I want to introduce on this litany is the claim that the solution is for blacks to buy black or bank black, and that it's the failure to actually purchase from black producers or black suppliers of products that leads to the low levels of wealth. But I think that this is associated with the phantasm of black capitalism. Okay. And it's a phantasm because if you just think about the claims that are frequently made about black buying power, I think we hear this frequently, that the black Americans have as much buying power as many nations throughout the world. Okay. Well, black Americans are not a separate nation. Black buying power is estimated to be a total of $1.2 trillion, which is an expression of the capacity of blacks to actually purchase goods. But it's not very informative about the capacity to accumulate wealth, which is carried over time. But we should also point out that the single bank, J.P. Morgan, has assets worth $2 trillion. Which far surpasses the total buying power of black Americans, and is also indicative of the scale of the differential between black wealth and white wealth, and gives us a deeper sense of the magnitude of the problem that has to be addressed. And can't be addressed, and this is the key point, it can't be addressed by autonomous or independent actions that black Americans take. And I think there's an underlying optimism in the dysfunction narrative that really is saying, well, we can remedy the situation if we just do the right thing. But doing the right thing does not close the racial wealth gap. Indeed, the top 100 black-owned firms grossed $24 billion and employed 73,000 workers in 2016. But Walmart alone grossed 20 times as much revenue and employed 2.2 million workers. This is to say that black business is at such a minuscule level that if we were to talk about blacks buying black or banking black as a solution to the racial wealth gap, then we're not going to get very far. Final observation in this context about black business development and entrepreneurship. It's important that any individual or any collectivity of individuals who try to start a new enterprise have an initial significant endowment of wealth. So the most spectacular recent case of wealth accumulation might be Jeff Bezos and Amazon. But Bezos starts out the game with $300,000. 2 decades ago, Timothy Bates observed that the individuals who are most likely to engage in self-employment and sustainable and successful self-employment are typically highly educated and have $100,000 in net worth. The median black family has less than $7,000 in net worth.
No, whatever you say. Okay, go ahead.
So Anne Farrow is not with us today, but she was generous enough to send her paper along. I will do my best to convey it. I've never met Anne before, but I'll try to be engaging. So that's all I can really promise you. So when I was a girl, my favorite Bible story was the one about St. Paul being knocked off his horse on the road to Damascus. I love the idea that there could be a single moment in one's life that changed everything, and that after that moment, one would see the world differently. My Damascus, and the moment I was changed and transformed utterly, came in April of 2002, when I was asked to help research a story on slavery in Connecticut. I was then a reporter and editor at the Sunday magazine of the Hartford Courant, and though I had grown up in Connecticut and lived there for much of my life, I could not have told you whether there had been ever a single enslaved person there. My specialty at the newspaper was writing about houses and gardens and literary figures. If I thought about slavery in New England at all, it was a very limited institution, neither socially nor economically significant, not important. But when God knocked me off my horse with the story of slavery in the North, he cast me forward into a landscape that I will never stop seeing. A landscape of suffering and deprivation and stolen labor that is overlaid upon beautiful New England. I was 51 when I discovered, in that spring 16 years ago, a story I will never cease exploring. That first investigation into slavery in Connecticut became a newspaper project and then a book called Complicity: How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery. And then another newspaper project and a second book. The book, published in 2014 by Wesleyan University Press, is called The Log Books: Connecticut, Slave Ship, and Human Memory. I would like to briefly share the stories of these two books with you today. They are my reparation to the people who suffered under slavery and to their descendants. Probably the strangest thing about the first book, which I wrote with my newspaper colleagues Joel Lang and Jennifer Frank, is that it was written by journalists, not historians. But our employer, the Hartford Courant, is the nation's oldest newspaper and continuous publication, founded in 1764, and our newspaper's involvement with slavery led to an editor's question: could we find an enslaved person who'd been insured by Aetna, the Connecticut-based insurer that had been named in a class action suit for having insured enslaved people, and write about that man or woman's life? The idea was that we would bring to life the story of a local person who had been a captive in colonial Connecticut. We quickly discovered that slavery was illegal in Connecticut by the time the Aetna Life Insurance Company was founded in 1853. But the question of Connecticut and slavery was before us. And in the months that followed, we learned that Connecticut had been home to thousands of slaves and been deeply involved in every aspect of captivity in America. Connecticut had provisioned the English Caribbean, where captives grew slavery for the Western world.
milled cotton grown by enslaved people in the South, formulated and promulgated racist theologies, and supported in every way the slave system in the South. I learned that the quaint Connecticut River Valley where I lived had been the manufacturing source for one of the most popular cotton hoes in the American South. The 80-page special edition of the Hartford Courant's Sunday magazine, published 5 months later, found its way into the hands of a literary agent in New York. And she said if we could broaden the scope of our work and make this kind of examination about New England, the region, it could be a book. Joel and Jenny and I spent the next half year writing Complicity, which had sold to a division of Random House. Over cafeteria lunches, the three of us hammered out a list of stories that we believed would help illuminate slavery in the North. We wrote a book that, when we assembled the draft months later, brimmed with extraordinary violence. And yet it was, and is, true to the nature of an oppressive system. We had all read the late 19th century history citing a, quote, kinder, gentler form of slavery that was said to have prevailed in the North. But what we found in the records and put into our books was a way of life governed by cruelty, fear, physical suffering, and misery. And the flip side of this suffering was economic success and comfort for white settlers and their descendants. The labor of enslaved people was what Bernard Bailyn called the, quote, key economic force that fueled New England's early and continuing prosperity. Do you think anyone will actually want to read this? A colleague at the newspaper asked me at the time. I wasn't sure how to answer him, but I knew that I had found my story. I had terrible dreams and researched horrors every day, but I'd found my story. And for me, the heart of the matter was always the suffering of enslaved men, women, and children. I wrote about Venture Smith, an enslaved man in Connecticut whose narrative brims with pain and injustice, and it seemed that everywhere I looked in the records of 18th and 19th century New England, there was a black man or woman being subjected to pain, humiliation, and killing labor. I wrote about enslaved black men in early Manhattan who faced death at the stake for their rebellion, and who stood trial without legal representation in the courtroom of a judge who called them black devils. I wrote about a son of a Rhode Island judge who moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and became the quintessential slave trader and plantation master. I wrote about a tribal people in East Africa who had their villages and lives torn apart so that they could become the porters of ivory tusks for the American piano industry, and so the piano could become the, quote, badge of gentility in American homes. In the spring of 2004, as my two colleagues and I were coming to terms with the draft we'd written, a friend sent me a photocopy of an article published in 1928 in the Hartford Times. The article described a set of ship's logbooks that had been acquired by the Connecticut State Library in 1920. The logbooks detailed 3 voyages made between January 1757 and August 1758. 2 voyages left New London for West Africa, and 1 voyage left Sierra Leone headed for the Caribbean. 3 different commanders, one of whom was a man from Middletown, Connecticut, were at the helm of these voyages, but the logbooks themselves appeared to be in the same handwriting throughout. The idea of Connecticut men commanding slave ships was new to me. Despite our state's proximity to Rhode Island, which was colonial America's largest transporter of slaves to the Caribbean and the colonies. But no book or scholar during my earlier research had suggested such a possibility to me, so I had not looked for the evidence of that commerce. The poet T.S. Eliot says in the last part of his poem, The Four Quartets, not seen because not looked for. The 250-year slave ship's logs are fragile, stored in a temperature-controlled manuscript vault. So when I went over to the Connecticut State Library on that May morning and read them, the librarian asked me to read them first on microfilm. Microfilm can be hard to read, and as I tucked the end of the film strip onto the spool, I wondered if I would ever be able to decipher the microfilm pages of 18th century handwriting. I worried that I didn't have enough background on the slave trade to understand what I would see, and indeed, it took me 6 fully parsed out years to see what I saw on those 80 neatly written pages. There were many entries I didn't understand. I didn't know why, as the ship neared Africa, crewmen were cleaning out the steerage, building an awning, and repairing the carriages. What was ricing, and the factory, and the pannier? Lately, I learned that all those terms are particular to a ship engaged in what was called the guinea trade. The keeper of the logbooks had very legible handwriting, but he was a terrible speller. And it took me months to understand that if I just followed the phonetic style of his spelling, I would be able to find the places where his 3 voyages touched. But on page 38 of what appeared to be the second voyage in the logbooks, the logkeeper noted, on Wednesday, April 13, 1757, on board the Good Hope lying at Bent's Island taking in rice slaves, wood, and water. Similar entries appeared for the next 3 days. Though I was confused about many of them and had no idea where Bent's Island might be because it is too small that it does not appear on modern maps, I understood that taking in slaves meant trading for human beings and putting them on a ship. I was about to make a journey of my own into these logbooks, and I would learn that the dozens of slave castles that once dotted the West African coast, tiny Bents may have sent an estimated 50,000 Africans into southern colonial slavery, a number that puts it very high on the Richter scale of the 18th century trade. And when Parliament outlawed the international slave trade, Bents vanished from the world's memory. The jungle claimed the tall walls of the fortress, and the trees grew up in the roofless yards, where captives were once held in hundreds for sale. My early tentative identification of the logkeeper as a local man named Samuel Gould vanished and was replaced by a more compelling evidence that surfaced and pointed to an aristocratic colonel named Dudley Saltonstall as the narrator of the tale. For almost 80 years, the logbooks sat on a shelf at the State Library waiting to tell their story, waiting to serve as a symbol of New England's long forgetting. The challenge to me has been to use them correctly and ethically in portraying a traumatic past. Reformer James Adams once said that the first function of memory is to sift and reconcile. I decided that sifting and reconciliation would be my work. When I worked on the Hartford Courant's first investigation into Connecticut's profound and complicated relationship with slavery, and after, when I wrote my chapters for the book that followed that project, I still thought of myself as a journalist, someone who was on assignment to produce a series of stories. But when I held the logbooks, and by special arrangement the actual documents were made available to me for weeks of study, I knew that I was, for real, in a new place, and that there would be no going back to the newspaper way of life. In the middle voyage of the 3 logbooks, Dudley Saltonstall, who was then 18 years old, describes his telegraphic fashion the outbreak of amoebic dysentery among the 169 captives held below deck on his vessel, a sloop called the Good Hope, under the command of a man named Alex Urquhart. 5 days after beginning the Atlantic crossing to the Caribbean, Saltonstall writes, "Slaves not very well. 2 days later, a man died. A day after that, 3 children. This 24 hours died 2 small boy slaves of the flux." Saltonstall writes on May 17th, "In the 21st days of the passage from Sierra Leone to St. Kitts, 12 captives die, 10 of them children. The gender of the 3 children, all of whom died on the 8th day of the voyage, was not given. The logkeeper describes them simply as small slaves." A pediatric gastroenterologist explained to me that these stolen children died of exhaustion and dehydration from the dysentery, and that they died before the adults because they were smaller, and the physical resources of their small body were used up more quickly. These children died during the Middle Passage, and so they were never given names in captivity. I have not been able to find other records of that voyage, and I do not know if their names were recorded. What I know about them is that they were betrayed, and that they died, and that I feel responsible to them and to their story. 6 months after seeing the logbooks on microfilm, I was on a plane to Belgium to catch a Swiss Air flight to West Africa. I had persuaded the management of my newspaper that a missing piece of Connecticut's history was lying on the ground on an abandoned island off the coast of Sierra Leone. Smart. 10 years later, almost to the day, the logbooks, which is my account of the story and what I learned in Africa and here in Connecticut, was published. Because we are here today concerned with the sites of stories of African Americans, I would like, with your permission, to read a few pages from the book. These pages are about my first visit to Bent's Island. I should explain that Anna Maria Falconbridge, who appears in this excerpt, was an Englishwoman visiting Sierra Leone in the early 1790s with her husband, Alexander Falconbridge. Alexander has been a physician involved in the slave trade who later fought against the trade and testified about its horrors to Parliament. You can tell from her narrative she doesn't really have a problem with the slave trade and thinks he's overzealous. The Joe to whom I refer is Joseph Opola, our guide and translator in Sierra Leone and a world authority on the history of the slave trade in the Sierra Leone River. John Easton, who I also mentioned, was a Middletown, Connecticut commander who had a very successful career in the slave trade and was the captain of the Africa, the ship whose voyage is the first of the 3 contained in the logbooks. Captain Easton was extremely well known in the trade and is buried in Middletown in Montmartre Cemetery. He was an officer in the first Masonic lodge established in Middletown in 1754, and he was quite an extraordinary and awful man. Richard Oswald, to whom I also refer, was the head of the consortium of London-based businessmen who leased Benzie Island from the local African king. Beginning an excerpt. We walked into the large brick-walled yard where the men would have been held, sometimes for many days, exposed to the heat and the rain. The ground was rough and patched with weeds and small trees. The sun felt merciless, and the surrounding walls were very tall, making the yard airless and chokingly hot. On a visit to the island in 1791, Anna Maria Falconbridge had strolled under the windows of Bart's Island House, as the fortress was then called, and looked down into this enclosure from the cool upper room she was about to enjoy dinner in. She writes, "Involuntarily I strolled to one of the windows a little before dinner without the smallest suspicion of what I was about to see. Then what my astonishment and feelings were at the sight of between 200 and 300 wretched victims chained and parceled out in circles, just satisfying the cravings of nature from a trough of rice placed in the center of each circle. Offended modesty rebuked me from not hurrying my eyes from such disgusting scenes. But whether fascinated by female curiosity or whatever else, I could not withdraw myself for several minutes, while I remarked some whose hair was withering with age, reluctantly tasting their food, and others, thoughtless from their youth, greedily devouring all before them. Be assured I avoided the prospects from this side of the house ever after. In the heat and silence, I felt as if I could not speak. Joe said, 'What?' No questions from the reporter, but then he leaned toward me and his voice was gentle. He said, 'No one speaks here.' By the time we visited Ben's Island in 1757, John Easton had already built a large gramble-roofed house on the Connecticut River, and he owned a wharf and livestock. He must have loved beautiful things, silver swords, English furniture, a Delft platter, and chocolate bowls. Because his will and property inventory, written in 1770, documents closely written pages of possessions, the kinds of things you see in New England historical societies and museums. The merchant, Richard Oswald, who participated in the slave trade on a much vaster scale than Easton, and probably would have found the Connecticut man provincial, had a castle on a river in Scotland, and collected landscapes and paintings with religious themes. He owned Scotland's first greenhouses where he grew sugarcane, fig trees, and exotic plants. Robert Adam, the great Scottish architect, designed a tea house for Oswald, in the shape of a miniature castle complete with turrets. To enter the slave yard, we had walked through a double door once used by the Gomitos, who were free black workers employed by the company to serve the interests of the trading post. They repaired ships, managed company vessels along the coast, and grew food for the fortress and for trade ships like the Africa. They carried in food and water to the captives and brought out buckets of human waste, passing under an armed guard position on the wall above the double doorway. There was no way for a captive escape, for even if he managed to escape the enclosure, there was an outer fortress wall that was locked and guarded. The island waters swarmed with crocodiles, and the neighboring islands were also leased to Oswald's company, so there was no refuge there either. There was a smaller, separate enclosure where the captive women and children were held, and this was adjacent to the barracoon. The inner and outer walls of this enclosure are particularly intact, but the roof that it once had is gone. Scholars estimate that women and children comprised about 1/3 of the total number forced into New World slavery. Tribal people were brought from many different locations in the interior and from along the coast to be sold at Bent's, and often, by the time they reached the island, they had passed through the hands of several traders. The purpose of the transatlantic slave trade was to acquire labor, and in the functioning of this trade, black people were separated from their homes, villages, and each other. James Stanfield, who has served aboard slave ships, then later regretted his actions, wrote to British anti-slavery advocate Thomas Clarkson and scoffed at the notion that slaves were spoils of, quote, intertribal wars. He said, "I am inclined to think that the method of collecting slaves by war, dreadful as that mode may be, is by no means the great support of the slave trade, but they are procured by still more infamous and horrid practice of kidnapping." The service entrance to the enclosure where captive men, women, and children were held for sale is a double doorway, one door diagonally behind the other to discourage the possibility of escape. These two doorways would have been guarded by a man with a gun. A trader might buy the mother and not the children, or the husband and not the wife, in the same way that enslaved families in America were separated and sold away from each other. Their ancestors had been separated and sold in Africa. First mentioned to me by Joseph Opala, the interruption of kinship systems is a natural function of the way that the slave trade placed great value on young, able-bodied men. Young, healthy women of childbearing age were also valued, but there was no advantage for traders to keep African families intact. The people held on Ben's Island would have been disoriented and frightened. They would have heard languages they've never heard before, and they might have been hungry and exhausted. Many captives were brought from inland Sierra Leone, as well as from inland regions of today, what are like Liberia and Guinea, and they never would have heard the wash of surf. They would have never seen anything like the island fortress, and they might never have seen white faces before. The shouted commands, the brutal examinations, guns, and beatings also communicated a message to the captives, even though they did not understand what was being said. Standing in the enclosure, I felt a chill, underlying the dense heat, and wondered if there exist a kind of terror so great that it can be part of a site and make it forever a place apart, suitable only for prayer and remembrance. The black traders working along the rivers and coastlines would have understood that the captives were destined for lives of hard physical labor because of the greatest demand was for adult men. But even these African traders, functioning against their fellow Africans, would never have seen a Caribbean sugar plantation, or a Carolina rice farm, or a New England village, or all the places where the captives lived. In 1737, a book-length account of English trade in Africa, Brazil, and the West Indies, Surgeon John Atkins wrote sympathetically, "To remove Negroes from their home and friends, where they are at ease, to a strange country, people, and language, must be highly offending against the laws of justice and humanity. And especially when this change is to hard labor, corporal punishment, and for masters they wish at the devil." And although the captives knew very little for certain, they knew enough to be afraid, and by the time they reached Ben's, they had already been separated from their home villages, which was a special kind of social death. When I saw the carefully maintained graves of long-ago chiefs at every turn introduced to the oldest people in villages we visited, I understood that tribal people of 2 and 3 centuries ago would never have left their homes, and that the slave trade interrupted sacred spiritual and domestic connections. To lose one's community was to lose everything that mattered. The people held aboard ships attempted to revolt against their captors, or tried to commit suicide by starving themselves or jumping overboard. The captives could not imagine their fate, but they probably knew, as they did their jailers and captors, that they were never coming back. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Shalini Ray, and along with my co-author and colleague, Al Brophy, we're both at the University of Alabama School of Law. We're working on a paper called Transitional Justice as Ordinary Injustice, and it's currently, it's in the early stages, and so your feedback is especially valuable. Sorry. It's currently formulated as a reply to a frequently cited article in the transitional justice literature, at least in the United States, an article by Eric Posner and Adrian Vermeule called Transitional Justice as Ordinary Justice. It was in the Harvard Law Review in 2003. So when countries typically emerge from mass trauma of some kind and the old regime has lost, the new state frequently grapples with how to transition away. Thank you. And how do I move it? Oh, okay. Got it. Okay, great. Thank you. So, sorry, I was saying that the new state sort of grapples with how to transition away from an oppressive regime toward a more liberal democracy. And transitional justice has often been defined in this context as a set of practices outside of the normal legal system. So the ICTY definition here, expressly states that just the sort of the scale of the human rights violations is so serious that the normal justice system will not be able to provide an adequate response. And so there are many definitions of transitional justice, but I just wanted to give you one that sort of taps into this idea that the normal justice system is inadequate. For example, there's often this problem of whether to apply new legal norms to condemn and punish conduct that was in fact legal under the old regime's laws. There's a question of how widely to redistribute property, if at all, if it might amount to something like a taking under U.S. Jurisprudence. And so in response to this widespread notion of the extraordinary nature of transitional justice, Posner and Vermeule sort of argue that actually it's completely continuous with ordinary justice, and that scholars and practitioners in the field have erred in conceiving of transitional justice as exceptional or somehow distinct. In their view, it's all a matter of degree and not kind. And part of their project is to really normalize transitional justice. They perceive a skepticism, in the academy, to principally, as their audience, a skepticism towards transitional justice because of some of the things I mentioned, this idea that, liberal norms that might be violated in the pursuit of liberal outcomes. So in order to punish wrongdoers, you have to apply, ex post facto sort of criminal punishments, things like that. So they sense this skepticism in the academy about transitional justice and aim to allay those fears and say, well, actually, you can achieve transitional justice with the ordinary legal system, and the ordinary legal system deals with transitions all the time, sort of what they claim. But we argue using Reconstruction as our main example, and that is the scholarly focus. Reparations and Reconstruction, as most of you know, is a huge part of Professor Brophy's scholarship. So using that as our main example, we argue pretty simply that normal legal tools are in fact inadequate, and a transitional justice program is going to have to be not only huge in terms of scale, but probably we're going to have to look towards more communitarian remedies, not, maybe have remedies that aren't tethered to individual rights so closely. And so the argument is that transitional justice actually has to be both enormous and exceptional in some ways, and traditional remedies don't work, aren't enough. So a natural question arises, why reply to this article and why reply now? That article was published in 2003, right? So what's the motivation? In part, our motivation for this reply arises from, I think, what we see as the daily evidence of Reconstruction's failure. One of the more prominent examples being the resurgence of white supremacy, for example, the violent neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville last fall. So it's very current, sort of the failure of Reconstruction is with us now. In terms of why this article, their article's been cited close to 250 times, and although that's a lot less than the 2,000 cites to some major transitional justice books like Rudy Title's book, Transitional Justice, it's still tremendously influential. And we think that approach of sort of the idea that transitional justice is just a matter of kind of fashioning remedies through the ordinary legal system, that's kind of where things went wrong with Reconstruction. And so that's why, we think it's still important to talk about this today. It's important to acknowledge the Reconstruction amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, were extraordinary. And so there was a form of extraordinary relief that resulted, but they were barely passed, and they were not passed in the most effective form. Professor Randall Kennedy, in his review of Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction, relays vividly how the 15th Amendment prohibits denying the franchise based on race, but doesn't affirmatively enfranchise black citizens. And so then that led to literacy tests, poll tax, et cetera, the circumventing of that basic goal of enfranchisement. Okay, so Reconstruction comes up fleetingly in their piece. They're mostly focused on Europe and Latin America and sort of 20th century transitions from communism or dictatorship to, more democratic societies. There is a brief mention of the transition involved with what to do with Confederate officials in the new regime. And to some extent, they note that there is a personnel problem, that you actually need people to staff the government. And so there wasn't a complete purging of Confederate officials. They're in fact sort of given law enforcement and other, government roles. And so it comes up briefly. And I think the way, in keeping with sort of their approach, transitional justice literature often draws on examples from outside the United States. But we want to draw it back in and focus on Reconstruction as incomplete transitional justice. Right. Okay. So I mentioned this just briefly, but to give a sense of why was Reconstruction incomplete, transitional justice, there were these amendments, but like I said, there's some problematic consequences. There was this, federal agency, Freedmen's Bureau, that was supposed to provide some property, which Professor Darity noted was sort of a substantive economic base for equality, that you need that. But really, that never happened. Essentially, the people who were compensated, and this is a point made earlier today, the people who were compensated were slave owners for the loss of their human property. Those are the people who got money. And then President Johnson pretty much hobbled the Freedmen's Bureau, didn't achieve its goal, and often land that had been abandoned was then given to former slave owners. And so neither the land nor any sort of compensation went to the people who had suffered. And that was largely that was largely symbolic of what Reconstruction consisted of. This is sort of self-explanatory, just sort of to drive the point home. No compensation, no redistribution of property, no purging of Confederate officials, little in the way of reconciliation efforts, and no apology. And that stands, even today. And I'm looking just from the federal government's perspective. I understand that state governments have maybe taken different measures. And so I don't think it's terribly controversial to say that just wasn't enough. I mean, if you look at, where we are today and how little was done. So the legacy of this incomplete transitional justice takes a variety of forms. Sort of in the near term, right after the end of the Civil War, you have, and the close of Reconstruction, you have the rise of the Klan. So you have Black Americans subject to extra-legal violence. You've got these disenfranchisement efforts that I referred to. And of course, there never really was an end to the ideology of white supremacy. So this is a picture of, it's actually Professor Brophy added this. So this is a picture of the Caswell County Courthouse in North Carolina, where a white state senator was murdered, and this basically set off, I believe, the Kirk Holden War in North Carolina, and you had the Republican governor Holden, fighting the Klan, and so just as an example of the kind of extra legal violence that was created. So I think apart from its inadequacy in the present time, there's also sort of how quickly Reconstruction wrapped up without getting the job done. And so the gains whatever gains were made, either on the books or substantively, were easily lost because we argue of this reliance on ordinary legal remedies. And then I think also it's important to see kind of how the amendments themselves were drained of their transformative power. So in 1903, in the Yale Law Journal, John Dos Passos writes an article, The Negro Question, in which he basically argues for decoupling citizenship from voting, and that the idea of having black citizens who cannot vote because he thinks they're not up to it. And so this is just a few decades after the war ended, and you already have, and he actually casts himself as an ally, right? And that's where we are, where the allies are talking in these terms. So I think it just underscores the point that when you don't make a sort of huge substantive change, you're locked in, and the old patterns are entrenched, and you don't achieve transitional justice. So one question that, I appreciate all of your input on as we're just thinking it through is sort of, I haven't seen too much literature discussing Reconstruction as an example of transitional justice, although please, let me know if I'm wrong on that. How might recasting Reconstruction as failed transitional justice enhance our understanding of transitional justice? I'm very interested in what you think about that. Superficially, it kind of refocuses the discussion on repair and redress. I think it might also point to the need for non-liberal or more communitarian remedies. And I welcome your feedback. Thank you.
So maybe we have a few minutes for one or 2 questions, maybe? We have 3.
Yes, thank you very much for these very thought-provoking presentations. Listening to this from a sort of outside perspective, I'm actually reminded of a scheme which was introduced in Germany in 1952. Not the thing we are going to talk about tomorrow, but it was it was called the Lastenausgleich, the equalization scheme, which basically looked at property and then levied a tax of 1.83% on property for a period until the 1980s in order to equalize the income and property situation between those Germans, about 11 million, who had lost their property in the eastern parts of Germany, which had been lost to Poland or to the Czech Republic, to Czechoslovakia at this time, and had arrived in Germany as refugees. A similar measure was introduced after German unification in 1990, the Solidaritätsbeitrag, the solidarity contribution. I think to American ears this might sound alien because it's based on the idea that the state has a social responsibility to provide for social equality, but in terms of sort of revising historical injustice, this might be an interesting model to look at, because the long-term effect, even though we face the same problems in Germany today you face in the US, we have an enormous gap between wealthy and poor people, and this gap is growing continuously since the 1980s, basically. But might be interesting in this term of reconstruction. Yeah, even though it's normally not quoted in this traditional idea of Wiedergutmachung or redress for victims, because it actually addresses issues of inequality within the perpetrator society, if you want to use this term.
Yeah, I made a few notes. Thank you for that, suggestion. We're always looking for analogies. I think, it is culturally and otherwise a big difference from, the U.S. legal culture and thinking about the role of the state and all of that. But I think it is really interesting. Thank you.
You want to talk? Yeah, so I think that is an interesting analogy, and I think it would be useful for us to explore it more, to see how it could be constructed so it could apply in the United States. But I was also thinking of a couple of other examples, which would be B.R. Ambedkar's insistence on the importance of having a major land reform to redistribute land to the Dalits in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a land reform that never took place in India. But I think it was conceptually, it was very much parallel to this notion that you were going to reconstruct the wealth distribution in the society to some degree by doing that. In Malaysia, it has not been land, but it has been the construction of a trust fund on behalf of the native Malays that consist of ownership rights to corporations that are traded on the Malaysian Stock Exchange. So that's the only major case I know of a major redistribution of wealth that's based upon, in quotes, in the Malaysian context, they would say it's racial lines. That's the only case I know of that's been conducted by a quasi-democratically elected government. But was only feasible in the Malaysian context, I believe, because the native Malays are a numerical majority in that society. But those are the two examples I was thinking of. when you were talking about the exclusion of, the inclusion of ex-Confederates. So one of the policies that was adopted in several countries in Eastern Europe is something that we call lustration, which was a policy of saying that that folks who had been collaborators with the previous regime could not participate in the political process. And I certainly don't think it's because there was a lack of personnel that that's the reason why the Confederates, yeah, I mean, they seized power. I mean, yeah, literally. And there was one last comment, which is kind of a snarky comment, but I think Richard Posner is the Amy Wax of legal history. Well, not everybody appreciated that, okay.
Yeah, just to your point about the legacy admissions, they were called legacy admissions, but they've never actually formulated them. It's one of those things that they put things out, make them sound good, but when we said, well, where are the guidelines for them? Oh, well, they're on the website. Carlton and I stayed on the phone together looking at the website, searching it, there's nothing there. Then they said, oh, well, if they want legacy admissions, they have to email this email address, which, of course, how do you find it? And there was never any real extension of the offer to pay for the education.
Right, I understand that even the application does not even mention the word descendants. There's nothing's changed. It was just a verbal, feel-good soundbite in the moment, and people just kind of took it and ran with it, but there was no substance there of any kind.
And a couple of people got it because they happened to hear about it, and they put it
in their statements.
bio,
Yes.
and then they got admitted based on that.
Uh-huh.
It's not something that if you were a descendant and didn't know
Right.
somebody else about it, you would find it.
It's an old story, right? Some of us are led to the trough, and the rest of us have to just kind of discern it from the air. Yeah. Is there a question here? Oh.
Can you say a little bit more about the communitarian remedies that you the reason why I say this is because during Reconstruction, even though, the whole process was flawed, it was doomed, in that framework, some very interesting things happened. I mean, black legislators introduced public education in the South for the first time, not just for black people, for everybody. So those are some of the things. So yeah, communitarian remedies.
Yeah, I think in a way communitarian was sort of our euphemism for illiberal, for the idea that, if you just stay within sort of a rights regime and respect everyone's property rights from before, there's not actually a way to change anything. There's going to have to be, perhaps some rights violations that go on in order to achieve transitional justice.
Obviously, communitarian for me means involving the broad base of the population actively.
No, and I think that also, I think that more broadly, that is correct, and that's, need to happen.
I think part of what was considered radical about radical Reconstruction was that with the 13th Amendment, property was confiscated without compensation. I mean, what we've learned from our keynote earlier today is that ordinary justice meant that slave owners received compensation in the context of abolition. And the 13th Amendment was a huge exception to that. But what wasn't done, it seems to me, was to sort of look back and say what had been considered legal was actually not consistent with the rule of law. That owning human beings was not consistent with the rule of law, and we knew it all along, and now we're going to enforce that idea. And so I see that could only happen, that thought could only happen in the context of transitional justice. That it could never be part of the ordinary course of law enforcement that you would continue to recognize property claims in human beings, which in fact is what happened. So I think Akil Amar has written an article about this. I can't remember the title right now, but I think he talks about Reconstruction and transitional justice, so you might want to take a look at that. I also want to say that I really appreciate Professor Darity's presentation because of not only the focus on racial disparities in wealth, but also because of centering this whole issue of property. Because one of the things that has occurred to me from recent research is that it's because of the enforcement of this idea that it was legal to have property in human beings that it became, and that if the state were to abolish that form of property, they had to indemnify or compensate the slave owners, that's part of the reason that slavery itself took so long in many instances to abolish, because of the need to compensate the slave owners. And that's something that, especially looking at Anna's book, became very clear to me when you look at it in a more globalized perspective, that you could have had a sooner abolition if there was not also a need to compensate slave owners.
Well, you know, one thing, though, that counters the point you're making is a gradual compensation for emancipation was available all along. And on at least 20 occasions, it was rejected. You know, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia is the only entity that ever said, yes, we'll do it. And people like, take my slaves, you know? I mean, once the money was there, they were ready to do it. But, you know, people would rather lose lives than take the money. So it's not like it wasn't available. It was available, and they said no.
I mean, even the Delaware legislature rejected compensated emancipation.
Yeah, one vote.
And that's a state where the slave presence was not as significant as in many other places.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't dependent on slave labor, and they still said no.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking of, regarding the comment you're making, and also Professor Ray, is, you know, the good thing about the law is if it doesn't serve the people, it can be changed. And the bad thing about the law is if it doesn't serve the people, it can be changed. So the question is, who are the people, right? You know, I mean, initially in this country, the legal status of children traveled with their fathers, right? And then somebody went, oh my goodness, we can't do that.
Somebody in Virginia?
Somebody in Virginia said, oh, we could, you know, we could simply just manufacture slaves if we just change the law.
Yeah,
right?
I was actually thinking of the situation specifically in Brazil, where even after the final abolition of slavery, the Minister of Finance had the records of slavery destroyed because of constant claims by the slave owners that you need to compensate us, we want to be indemnified. So, of course, in destroying all of the records, it also made it more difficult for the slaves to later come along and say, we would like reparations as well.
Very good point.
I don't think I really need a microphone, so, I mean, I'm reluctant to disagree with our host, but it seems to me factually incorrect to say that, you know, we always knew that slavery was wrong. I mean, it's been more or less universal until the relatively recent past, and in some sense, that's why we're having the discussion we're having, right? And it bears on my kind of reaction to your paper, which revolves around the question that, you know, historians of slavery have kind of made a distinction between slave societies and societies with slaves. In other words, one was pervasive, it was the fundamental foundation of the, the economy and the society, and one is a presence, but not really as significant. This has obviously been applied to the South and the North of the United States. And I wonder whether, given what you said to us today, whether that distinction can really be upheld, or are you saying that really doesn't make any sense, or how would you respond to that? And the question I have for Professor Darity is, you're an economist, I take it, and the focus on wealth is obviously the kind of thing that an economist would focus on.
Well, no, actually, most economists don't focus on wealth.
Okay, but as opposed to cultural or other kind of thing.
Okay.
In the case of African Americans, as I argue in this book that I wrote, I mean, it's true that primarily, it seems to be, the issue has to do with wealth, that inequalities rooted in wealth, and less to do, as it does with, say, Native Americans or Native Canadians, with cultural sort of symbolism, that sort of, which they may regard as very important, but it's not so much a central part, I think, of the...
Well, actually it is because of land appropriation.
Well,
I mean, that's fundamental, and that's part and parcel of the destruction of their cultural position.
Sure. I'm talking about in the African American case, it is fundamentally, it seems to me, an economic phenomenon. So basically, I just...
But I'm saying it also is for the other groups that you're talking about.
It has an economic dimension, but it also has a cultural dimension that is not so salient in the African American case.
Well, I mean, you could make the argument that slavery, I don't know, this gets into this whole debate over African retentions, but okay.
So my question simply to you was, so what does reparations mean to you?
As I said, it means eliminating racial disparities that are associated with economic well-being.
Okay, and how are we going to get there?
We're going to engage in a massive program of redistribution of wealth.
Okay. That sounds simple. So
I mean, are you asking a political question, or are you asking a mechanical question?
Well, both at some point.
Yeah. So the political question, the answer to the political question for me is that, and maybe this is an unorthodox thing to say in the midst of a community of lawyers, but I don't think that reparations can be accomplished via the legal process. I don't think it can be done by judicial fiat. We've seen how that worked out with respect to school desegregation, for example. Okay, so it must be something that's done by congressional legislation, and that can only be accomplished if you can get up to about 40 to 45% of white Americans to agree that reparations is a good idea. So that's the political task, is to persuade a significant portion of the American public that this is the right thing to do. And that's the challenge. That's not an easy task. But I will say this, if you were to look at the estimates on the numbers of whites who were in support of reparations in the middle of the 1990s, it might have been about 4%. And today it looks like the number is closer to the vicinity of 15 to 20%. And so I think you got to keep pushing at the mountain. Yeah.
Well, and if I understand your question about, how did communities look, whether there's physical presence of enslaved Africans or not, there's all kinds of evidence that shows that, people who didn't own slaves, didn't think about slavery necessarily, were invested in the slave trade. It was almost like the Depression in a way. You had, shoe cobblers who were buying stocks in slave ships so they could send their kids to school. A phenomenal network of people were out, literally. It was almost like a Ponzi scheme in some ways. Selling people small shares, insurance policies. It was just incredible. It was money to that would provide funds for barrel makers. It's something like a CSA, community supported agriculture, right? You buy in on the front end, and you hope that the slave ship doesn't sink or that there's not a mutiny, and that you get a share. And so, there's no one really during that period who was not benefiting in some way. Either you worked for a sail maker, you worked for the barrel maker, you worked for the iron worker. Everybody was profiting from the trade. And this whole notion that people weren't aware, or what did you say, that slavery was not seen we've always sort of known it, or we always accepted it. This is not true either. I mean, there were, Black people were not always identified in the Americas as slaves. That's not true. Now, it certainly didn't take long for white people to look up and say, oh my goodness, we can label these people, we can tag them because they have black skin, right? I mean, you can almost imagine, these folks like, there are periods when you're looking at the records where there'll be no laws, and then boom, 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 here are 12, right? And then there'll be a slave uprising, and then boom, 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 here are 14 more new laws. So it's a very direct connection between the ability, the need for, bodies to produce these crops, to do this labor so that white people could have leisure. It's a very clear thing. I mean, it's our misfortune that we were easily spotted, right? If we didn't have black skin, who knows what would have happened, right? But it made it just very, very simple for people to say, there are all kinds of instructions that clergy wrote and sent out to folks who were in divinity schools on how to explain this, because it wasn't straightforward. People didn't just say, oh, that's it. You had a few people who thought this through and used their form of social media and got the message out. And it made a lot of sense to people. This will work. We can make this stick. And they did.
I just wanted to respond to some of the comments and also engage with what Sandy and Kirsten said. The issue of the North and the South and this issue of the slave societies and societies with slaves, of course, that we know the difference in the book. I explored that, and many others did that. But today in the works that are being done, it's pretty much clear that slavery, that the North, even when the slavery was being abolished already, that they were profiting from the cotton and from everything, and this is what you presented in your, and you were talking about the wolf and several others.
So, New York is considered seceding during the war.
Yeah.
They were so tied to cotton that they considered seceding. New York City, yes.
And then when you take the example that you are going to discuss in the other conference, but about the universities, for example, all these Ivy Leagues, they are not in the South, they are in the North, and they are those that were built on the wealth produced with slavery. Regarding the issue of the compensation, however, like even in the North, when we had gradual abolition, the gradual abolition was intended to provide compensation then on the free womb laws, that here you don't call that way. We had in the United States in the North these free womb laws, and the owners, they were compensated. But what it was, you are compensated and you keep the slaves until they have a certain age, and many of them, they were slaves until they died. Then I think that this is something that is important as well. The question of how slavery was not perceived as wrong, I think that since the 18th century, there is, for many, then in this country at least, an abolitionist movement, also in the British Atlantic, the British Empire in England and the British Caribbean. I think that the idea that that was wrong was pretty much present there. But even this minority, they stuck. They really were. They didn't want this to finish. But and this is why we had a war here. But at the end of the day. The idea that it was wrong is present since the 18th century at least.
Yes.
Now, the questions that Sandy brings...
And I would add to that the first abolitionists were the enslaved folks.
Yeah, this idea is wrong, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is just that. Sorry? Oh, no, yeah, no, if
Okay,
you look,
fine.
that slavery existed since the world is world, there was a slavery then, of course, you can go back up to there. But if you are talking about Atlantic slavery, sorry?
There's a important difference from what I've learned. I may be wrong, y'all can tell me if I'm wrong. But what I understand in terms of chattel slavery, which was the
Yes, sir.
big form of slavery here.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
was one of the only forms, if not the only form, that stripped names, that stripped language, that people were enslaved for many years. But enslaved Africans lost everything about themselves. Now, I don't know if that's right. That's what I learned.
Yeah, how can I say? I think that we never lose everything, that people, they were able to preserve, but I think that we're talking about in that framework, because if we start moving the framework, then you are going to talk about the slavery in Africa, the Muslim slave trade, and the slavery in Asia, then we don't go anywhere. Regarding the issue of inequalities, I think that it surprises me in Sandy's work that we still need to make that argument and develop that argument that people are in this country are saying that the wealth gap is because people, they are spending money with shoes. Then I think that the issue of the inequalities, I think that even if some people here, I know that they do not agree with the possibility of having anything that can be global in terms of reparations. There are global inequalities when you are talking about people of African descent. Let's stay here in the Americas. In terms of these inequalities, I am not an economist. I know nothing about numbers. But in Brazil, there are people who work on that, and they can make the same claims.
Yeah, there's a West Indian economist named Ralph Henry, and he says black people are in the poorest countries, and in the countries where, in the wealthier countries, they're the poorest people in the wealthiest countries. So
yes, and then I think that
it's a universal.
Yeah, and I just bring again the example of Brazil, that even if I consider that it didn't go far enough, there were attempts of wealth redistribution recently. And this is what we are seeing in Brazil now with this sort of backlash or white lash, is exactly a reaction to this idea of attempting to redistribute. But in Brazil, of course, you're talking about more than 50% of the population who is of African descent. There is just that I think that perhaps this is a common ground, and is the same when you are talking about Haiti, the Caribbean, and other countries in Latin America.
I would like to say, though, that your proposal, when you presented, of the formation of a commission, is, I think, a critical first step in this process. I think that's vital, and it needs to happen. Yeah.
I just want to make a quick footnote about Gerald Bowen's work. You guys have seen it? You know, the counter-revolution of 1776.
Yeah.
I mean, the revolution...
Can you all give him a mic, please?
Okay,
Okay.
I just want to make
Just to hear his question.
announcements, but we have one student, I'd like to give her an opportunity to ask her question.
Oh, so sorry.
And then we have to stop.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Wesley. I really have enjoyed the conversation, and I enjoyed Professor Dario's discussion of kind of the continued, system and implications of slavery even into modern day. And my question just focuses on the fact that, we've seen in some other countries that have even attempted to do any sort of reparation or something like that, like some form of a truth and reconciliation of the wrongdoing. And I think that in America, we still, kids still being forced to go to school in schools named after Civil War generals, and, just the continued systems of slavery through gentrification and through the prison system and all these other systems that we have, kind of continuing that legacy. And I just want to know, I believe in reparations personally, but is it premature to discuss reparations before we can discuss truth and reconciliation as a mandate? Because there's no way to get reparations, like you said, without legislature, without some sort of a popular vote, electing people to get it done. So how can we possibly push that ball forward in terms of truth and reconciliation in order to achieve reparations?
So, I don't know. I'm not all that interested in reconciliation. No, but let me explain. I think Kirsten and I talk about the acronym ARC, and our acronym ARC refers to 3 phases of a reparations program. The first is acknowledgement, which I think lots of people have talked about today. But acknowledgement, which has typically been the product of most truth and reconciliation commissions, has not resulted in the second phase. I also want to mention that the United States Congress has, in quotes, apologized for slavery. Okay, I think it's important to, recognize that that apology has been made, but the apology was made in such a way that no commitment was made to the second stage of reparations, which is redress. And redress is where the compensatory dimension has to be addressed and executed. But then the third thing is not what I would call reconciliation. We refer to closure. So the premise here is that with a satisfactory scheme of redress in place and executed, then the victimized community would not make any further claims on their own behalf as a consequence of their history of victimization. Now, if some new injustice is executed against them, then it would be entirely legitimate for them to make a new claim. But that's the 3 things. I guess, the term reconciliation has kind of a kumbaya feel to it, and I'm not particularly interested in that.
The other point, too, is that for us, the closure piece would be accompanied by a major ongoing educational piece, right? And we were very intrigued to see how, in the case of Japanese American reparations, how, first of all, there was a very small amount of money that was allocated to begin with, and then I think only 1/10 of that was actually appropriated, and something like 12 years after the fact. And I want to see, I have to ask each audience, how many of you ever saw any PSAs about Japanese reparations? Anybody? So the only people I've ever known who saw any were people who lived in the Bay Area in California, who are of a certain age. So, we need more than that. We need more than that.
We need to thank our panelists.